Hey, welcome back. Go ahead and get settled in wherever you are tonight. Pull up a blanket, dim the lights around you, and just let your shoulders drop for a minute. I do not know if it is late where you are, or if you're squeezing this in on a lunch break, or maybe you've got tomorrow off and you are finally letting yourself stay up too late on purpose. Wherever you are, whatever kind of day you have had, I am glad you found your way here tonight. So picture this for a second. A father walks his 6-year-old daughter into the busiest square in ancient Rome, and walks home without her. She is not lost, she is not being punished. She has just been chosen for something so absolute that by that same afternoon, even her own name is taken from her. Tonight we step into the strange, glittering world of the Vestal Virgins, the women Rome trusted with the safety of an entire empire. And by the end of this journey, I want you to ask yourself, could you have lasted a single day in her place before we get into it? Do me one small favour. If this kind of story is exactly your speed, tap that like button for me, and if you have not already, go ahead and subscribe so you do not miss where this series is headed next. It helps this little corner of the internet more than you would think, and I would love to know a bit about you too. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're tucked in tonight, and what time it is on your clock right now. There is something almost wonderful about knowing that people scattered across a dozen different time zones are listening to this same fire crackle at the exact same moment. Alright, let us set the mood properly. Turn the lights down just a touch more, if you can. Maybe switch on a fan or some soft background hum, something to sit gently underneath my voice. Get comfortable, because we're about to travel back more than 2,000 years, to the morning a little girl stopped being a child and started being something Rome considered sacred. We do not know her real name. History rarely bothered writing down the names of 6-year-old girls, especially in a city run almost entirely by men, so let us just give her the name Rome itself would have given her, the very moment she was chosen. They called her Amata. That morning probably started like any other. A small stone house somewhere near the hills of Rome, a hearth fire being coaxed back to life before the sun had even fully risen, smoke curling up through a gap in the roof, the smell of bread from a neighbour's kitchen drifting in through an open door, her mother, working quickly through her hair, braiding it the way mothers have braided their daughters' hair since long before anyone thought to write anything down. Maybe Amata complained that it was too tight. Maybe her mother told her to hold still, just this once, because today mattered more than any other day so far in her short little life. Outside the city was already waking up around them, cartwheels grinding over uneven stone, someone shouting about fresh fish 2 streets over, neighbours leaning out of doorways to trade a bit of gossip before the heat of the day set in. To most people walking through it, this looked like any other morning in Rome. But for a very small number of families scattered across the city, it was the single most important day their daughters would ever experience, and every one of them knew it. Because today Amata's father was taking her to the Forum, the beating heart of the whole city, along with 19 other girls exactly her age, each one arriving from a different corner of Rome with a parent gripping her hand a little too tightly. The crowd there was already thick by the time they arrived. Senators in their heavy robes, curious onlookers who came every single time this happened the way people gather for anything rare enough to talk about later, and near the centre of it all the 20 girls were lined up one after another, dressed carefully, scrubbed, clean-standing, perfectly still, while a stranger in a heavy robe moved slowly down the row, studying each of their faces like he was choosing produce at a market. Except the thing being chosen here was a child's whole future. This stranger held one of the most powerful titles in Rome. He was the high priest of the whole city, the man responsible for keeping peace between mortals and the gods. And on this particular morning, his job was almost unbearably specific. He was not looking for the smartest girl, or the prettiest one, or even the best behaved. He was looking for a girl who checked every single box on a list that had existed for longer than anyone alive could remember. Both of her parents still had to be living. Her family had to be freeborn. with a spotless reputation, and she herself had to be in the cold language of Roman law, entirely without physical or mental defect, which is really just a clinical way of saying that even the smallest thing, judged by a stranger's eyes, could quietly decide the rest of her life. 20 girls stood in that square that morning. Only one of them would be walking away as something other than a daughter. The other 19 would go home with their parents by midday, back to ordinary meals and ordinary chores and ordinary lives, most of them probably relieved, a few of them possibly disappointed, none of them ever quite forgetting the morning they stood in a line and were silently measured against a list they did not fully understand. There was a strange hum in that crowd, if you can picture it. Half excitement, half something closer to dread. Because everyone standing there, all the senators and merchants and curious neighbours, understood exactly what was about to happen to one of those 20 girls, even if the girls themselves were still too young to fully grasp it. Some of the parents were quietly hoping their daughter would be passed over. Others were hoping for the exact opposite, because the family of a chosen girl gained a strange kind of standing in Roman society overnight, the sort of prestige money alone could not buy. Here is the part that always gets me. Honestly, this was not exactly a punishment, and it was not exactly a gift either. Being chosen meant instant staggering privilege. It also meant your childhood ended that same afternoon, with no negotiation and no way back. If reality television had somehow existed in ancient Rome, this would have been the single highest stakes audition in the whole city's history. Except nobody got voted off. Somebody simply got picked, and that, as far as Rome was concerned, was that. When the priest's eyes finally settled on Amata, he did not ask her opinion. He did not really ask her father's permission either, even though her father stood right there beside her. He simply reached out, took her small hand in his, and said the words that had been spoken to girls just like her for generations before this exact moment. I take you chosen and named Amata from this day forward to serve the goddess Vesta as her priestess, and to carry out the sacred duties owed to Rome on behalf of its people. And with that, she stopped belonging to her father. Under Roman law, a father held almost total authority over his children for their entire lives. No matter how old they grew, a grown man with children of his own, and a career and grey hair could still technically remain under his own father's legal control. But the instant the priest spoke those words, Amata slipped out of that whole system, completely and for good. She was not being handed over to a future husband someday, the way most Roman girls eventually were. She simply left the structure altogether. From that morning on, she could own property, she could write a will, she could stand in a courtroom and have her word alone treated as fact, with no oath required at a time when most Roman women could barely speak for themselves in public at all. It sounds almost unbelievable, and it should, because it was. Most Roman women, no matter how wealthy or well married, still needed a male guardian's approval just to handle their own money or settle a legal matter for the whole of their lives. Amata at 6 years old would eventually need approval from absolutely no one. A 6-year-old girl had just gained more legal power in one single afternoon than most grown women in Rome would ever hold across their entire lives. But everything comes with a price, and hers was steep. Her long hair, the very same hair her mother had braided so carefully that morning, was cut short right there in public and hung on the branch of a sacred tree as an offering. She was dressed head to toe in plain white, wrapped in a veil that marked her, instantly and permanently, as something set apart from every other girl in the city. She would not be going home that evening, not to that little stone house, not to that hearth, not to that mother who had just done her daughter's hair for the very last time, without either of them fully realizing it in the moment, then still barefoot, still blinking from everything that had just happened to her. Amata was walked past the crowd, past her own father toward a large quiet house at the edge of the square, a house with a courtyard and a pool of still water, and a fire already burning somewhere deep inside it, one that, as far as anyone in that crowd was concerned, had been burning for longer than any of them had been alive. This was where she would sleep tonight. And tomorrow night, and almost every night, for the next 30 years, from this day forward, Amata belonged to that flame, one that could never be allowed to go out, and to a vow so absolute that breaking it, even decades later, could mean being sealed alive beneath the ground with nothing but a little bread, a little water and one small lamp for company until the light and the air both quietly ran out. We will get to that part of her story a little later. I promise you, we will. But right now, just imagine you are her father walking home alone through that same crowded square, past the other 19 families, knowing your daughter is not coming back with you tonight, or any night for the next 30 years of her life. Imagine you are her mother, standing there staring at a braid of hair still resting in your hands, and imagine, for just a second, that you are Amata herself, 6 years old, dressed head to toe in white, standing beside total strangers, wondering in that quiet and confused way only a child can. What exactly just happened to your entire world? That is where we are starting tonight. Not with battles or emperors or the collapse of some great civilization, but with one small, ordinary hand reaching out to take hold of one small, ordinary girl in one crowded square, on one otherwise unremarkable morning. And yet, in a strange way, that handshake would shape the next 30 years of her life more than any war ever could. Somewhere behind her, her father was already walking home alone past market stalls he'd passed 1,000 times before, suddenly seeing all of it a little differently. Somewhere in that small stone house, her mother was probably still holding on to that braid of cut hair, unsure what to do with her hands now that there was no one left to braid for, and somewhere inside that quiet courtyard beside a fire she had not yet learned to fear or to love, Amata was beginning the very first hour of a life that almost nobody watching her that morning could have fully imagined. So here is the question I want you to sit with for the rest of tonight. Would you have survived it? Not the flame itself, not yet, but everything that came before it. The strangers judging your body like a checklist, the hand taking yours without asking, the version of your own name disappearing before lunchtime, because for Amata, the hardest part of this story had not even begun yet, and neither has ours. To really understand why Rome would do something like this to a child over and over again, for more than 1,000 years straight, we have to go back even further than Amata. Before Rome existed at all, before the Forum, before the priests and the laws, and the 20 frightened girls standing in a line. Back to the one thing this entire story truly circles around, the thing Amata was about to spend the rest of her life protecting with absolutely everything she had. A single flame. One that, according to the Romans themselves, was never ever allowed to go dark. A flame like that does not just appear out of nowhere. And if you are anything like me, the moment someone tells you a fire burned non-stop for over 1,000 years, your first question probably is not how. It is why anyone would ever believe that mattered enough to hand a whole civilization's safety to a child. So let's back up. Not centuries before Amata, but almost to the very beginning of Rome itself, long before there was a forum to stand in, or a high priest with the authority to take a little girl by the hand. There was a goddess the Romans called Vesta, and here is the strange part, the part most people never quite hear about. In a religion absolutely packed with dramatic, larger-than-life gods, throwing lightning bolts and starting wars over bruised pride, Vesta almost never showed up looking like a person at all. No towering statue in flowing robes, no carefully carved face for anyone to kneel in front of. Her entire presence inside her own temple, in the middle of the busiest city in the ancient world, was a fire. Just a fire sitting quietly on a stone hearth, doing nothing but existing. And somehow that alone made her one of the most important deities the Romans had. There is something almost refreshing about that, if you ask me. A goddess who skipped every jealous rage subplot the rest of the pantheon seemed to be working through, and just stayed home by the fire instead. And she was not some minor background character either. Roman tradition placed her as the daughter of Saturn's sister to Jupiter himself, the king of all the gods along with Juno Neptune, and a handful of others whose stories usually involve considerably more thunder and scandal. The Greeks worshipped a nearly identical figure under the name Hestia, which tells you this was not some strange local quirk invented in one corner of Italy. Across the entire ancient Mediterranean, people kept arriving at the same quiet conclusion. Whatever else the gods were doing up on their mountains and in their storms, someone still needed to watch the fire at home. But calling Vesta the goddess of fire is not quite right either. She was the goddess of hearth and home and family, which sounds cozy and small until you realize the Romans did not actually separate those ideas from the survival of the state itself. Every Roman household, rich or poor, kept a small fire burning at its center day and night. That fire was where meals were cooked, where the family gathered, where certain quiet little rituals were carried out that most people never wrote down because they were simply too ordinary to mention. It was less an object and more a kind of quiet, constant presence in the room, one that every single member of the household understood without ever needing it explained. Now stretch that idea across an entire city. The great public flame kept in the forum was not a separate belief from the one burning in someone's kitchen. It was the exact same idea, just scaled up until it covered every citizen at once. One Roman writer put it about as well as anyone ever has, noting that this shared public hearth quietly turned the entire population of Rome into members of one enormous household. Not a metaphor either. As far as Roman thinking went, that was nearly literal truth. Think about it for a second, actually. Is there something like that in your own life? Maybe not a literal fire, but some small, constant thing sitting quietly in the background of every important moment your family has ever had. So familiar you stopped noticing it was even special at all. Here is where it gets a little stranger, though. The Romans themselves did not think this particular fire started in Rome. According to their own stories, it started in Troy. Stick with me here because this part sounds a bit like a legend wrapped inside another legend, and honestly it kind of is. As the story goes, when Troy finally fell after that famously endless war, a soldier named Aeneas escaped the burning city carrying his household gods on his back, along with a fire pulled from the ruins before it could go dark for good. He sailed west for years, lost grieving, dragging a handful of surviving Trojans across the Mediterranean, until he eventually landed on the coast of Italy and founded a small settlement called Lavinium. His descendants later built a city called Alba Longa, and Roman tradition holds that this exact same ever-burning fire and the virgin priestesses who protected it existed there for generations long before Rome was ever built. Is that verifiable history? Not really, no. But it tells you something true about how the Romans saw themselves, which honestly matters just as much. They did not just think of themselves as some new city that popped up out of nowhere. They believed they were the direct descendants of catastrophe survivors, carrying one unbroken flame all the way out of a burning city across a sea and into the future. Those household gods Aeneas supposedly carried on his back by the way the Penates were kept in Vesta's temple, right alongside the sacred fire itself for centuries afterward. Small, humble little figures representing the safety and continuity of the household, tucked in beside the flame, as if the two ideas were really just one and the same thing wearing different faces. There is a strange kind of comfort in that pairing if you sit with it for a moment, building your entire identity around the belief that even after everything falls apart, something can still be carried out of the ashes and kept alive. The part of this story we can actually stand on with a bit more historical footing starts a little later, with a king named Numa Pompilius. Numa was Rome's second king, ruling somewhere in the 7th century before the Common Era, and Roman historians consistently credit him with turning this old household custom into something official, a real institution, a real building, a real permanent home for that fire sitting right in the center of the city he was helping to shape. Numa gets credited with a whole stack of Rome's earliest religious institutions, not just this one priesthood's festivals, even an early version of the calendar, which tells you something about the kind of ruler he apparently was. Less interested in conquest, more interested in giving a young, rough, still slightly chaotic city something steady to organize itself around. A fire that never went out was in a way the perfect symbol for exactly that ambition. And that building, by the way, looked nothing like the other important temples going up around Rome at the time. Most Roman temples were rectangular, carefully squared off, lined up with the four directions like everything about them had been measured twice. Vesta's temple was round. Deliberately, purposefully round, built to echo the shape of the earliest, most primitive homes in the region, small circular huts with a single hole cut into the roof to let the smoke escape. Walk through the excavated hut foundation still visible on the Palatine Hill today, and you can practically see where the idea came from. Inside that round temple there was no statue of Vesta waiting for visitors. None at all. The fire itself was her image, arguably the only major deity in Rome who never needed a carved face because every single person who ever prayed to her had already seen exactly what she looked like, flickering quietly in their own kitchen the night before. Once each year on the 15th of June, the Vestals swept out an entire year's worth of ash from that hearth and carried it down to the river Tiber, letting the current pull it away. A kind of yearly reset. Out with the old keep the flame start again. Simple and strangely moving when you picture it. Picture the whole scene for a second, actually, because I think this part gets skipped over too quickly. At night, with most of the forum dark and quiet, that small round building would have been one of the only sources of light for streets in every direction. This soft, steady glow coming from a single window, visible from rooftops across the city. Generations of Romans grew up seeing that glow every single evening of their lives, the way you might glance at a porch light left on for you without ever really thinking about who kept it burning or what it would mean if one night it simply was not there. Because the Romans took the opposite scenario extremely seriously. If that flame ever did go out even accidentally, even for a few minutes through nothing more than carelessness, it was treated as a genuine crisis, not an inconvenience. The Vestal responsible could expect a harsh beating from the high priest himself as punishment for negligence. And if people suspected the fire had gone dark for a darker reason entirely, if whispers started that maybe it was not carelessness at all, well, that particular accusation carried consequences far more serious than a beating, and we'll get into exactly how serious later in this journey. For now, just hold on to this feeling, an entire city watching one small flame, quietly terrified of the dark. But here is where the story takes a turn that caught me off guard the first time I came across it, and it happened generations before Numa back in that older city of Alba Longa. There was a Vestal priestess there named Rhea Silvia, and her story is not some gentle footnote. It is, according to Roman legend, the actual origin story of Rome itself. Rhea Silvia was a princess. Her father, the rightful king of Alba Longa, had been overthrown and pushed aside by his own brother, a man named Amulius. And Amulius, being the kind of ruler who planned several steps ahead, did not just want the throne. He wanted to make absolutely certain nobody in his brother's bloodline could ever threaten it again. So he forced his niece Rhea Silvia into the priesthood of Vesta, not out of religious devotion, as a political maneuver. A permanent vow of chastity meant she could never have children, which meant she could never produce an heir who might one day grow up and take his stolen throne back. It very nearly worked exactly the way he planned it. Except according to the legend, Rhea Silvia became pregnant anyway by, of all beings, the Roman god of war himself, Mars. Some older versions of the story name a different, equally larger-than-life father, but Mars is the version that stuck. She gave birth to twin boys. Her uncle, unsurprisingly furious and more than a little threatened, ordered the infants drowned in the river. His servant tasked with the job apparently could not bring himself to finish it, and instead set the babies adrift in a basket on the rising Tiber, the way you might if you could not do the thing you were told but were too afraid to simply disobey outright. The basket washed up near a fig tree on the riverbank, and the twins somehow were still alive. According to the legend, a wild she-wolf found them first, and rather than treating two abandoned human infants the way you would expect, she fed and sheltered them until a shepherd stumbled across the scene and took them in for good. Those two boys grew up and grew ambitious and eventually went off to found an entirely new city of their own. One of those boys was named Romulus. You already know which city he built. So somewhere at the very root of an entire institution, built specifically to guarantee purity, obedience, and total political control, sits a woman who broke every single rule that institution was designed to enforce. And out of that exact broken rule came the founder of Rome. I have never quite decided whether the Romans found that detail a little embarrassing or secretly quietly proud of it. Maybe both at once. Maybe that is just what founding myths do. They let a civilization admit its own contradictions without ever having to say so directly. It also tells you something important about why this all mattered so much for a girl like Amata centuries later. This was never simply superstition to the Romans, some old habit nobody bothered questioning. The flame represented survival itself, memory itself, the entire idea that Rome could trace an unbroken line all the way back through kings, through Alba Longa, through Troy, through fire and flood and a river that somehow refused to let two abandoned infants drown. Let that fire go dark even once, and you are not just risking a bit of smoke and inconvenience. You are risking the story Rome told itself about who it was and why it deserved to still exist at all. And here is the part I find truly fascinating, the kind of detail that never quite made it into the version of this story most people learn. Rome kept telling that founding myth proudly publicly for the better part of 1,000 years, all while its living, breathing Vestals were held to a standard so absolute that the very thing Rhea Silvia was famous for doing could get one of them buried alive. Nobody in the Senate ever seemed to notice or mention or particularly care about that contradiction out loud. Sometimes a civilization can build an entire identity on a story it would never under any circumstances allow to happen twice. That is the weight Amata was handed the moment the priest took her hand in the forum. Not just a chore, not just a set of rules to memorize. An entire civilization's sense of its own continuity resting on the shoulders of a 6-year-old girl who a week earlier had probably been far more worried about a scraped knee than the fate of an empire. And maybe that is worth sitting with for a moment before we keep going. How many things in your own life or your own family carry that same kind of weight, without anyone ever announcing it out loud? A story told at every holiday. A recipe nobody wrote down because everyone just assumed someone would always remember it. We are not so different from the Romans in that particular way even now. We just do not usually hand the job to a 6-year-old. And that fear, that quiet, constant dread of the flame ever going dark is exactly why what happened to a girl like her in the years right after that first afternoon in the forum mattered just as much as the ceremony itself. Because becoming a Vestal was never really about one single dramatic moment in a crowded square. It was about everything that came after it day after day for years most people never think to ask about at all. It was about everything that came after it day after day for years most people never think to ask about at all. So let's actually ask. What happened to a 6-year-old girl during the 10 years between being taken from her family and actually becoming the kind of Vestal you picture when you hear that word? The calm, composed priestess tending a flame in front of a crowd, because here is something most retellings skip right over. Service to Vesta was not one long uniform stretch of 30 identical years. Roman tradition split it into 3 very distinct chapters, each exactly 10 years long. The first decade was for learning. The second was for actually carrying out the duties everyone associates with the role. And the third and final decade she would spend passing everything she knew down to the next terrified 6-year-old standing in the forum. Amata at this point in her story had not even finished chapter 1. Picture where she was living now. The Atrium Vesti stood right beside the temple itself, an impressively grand building for its time built around an open courtyard with a long reflecting pool running down the middle of it. Along the edges of that courtyard stood statues one after another honouring past chief Vestals who had served with particular distinction. If you visit the ruins of that courtyard today, you can still see the pedestals those statues once stood on. And here is a detail that always sends a small chill through me. On a handful of those pedestals, the name that should be carved underneath the statue has been deliberately scratched away. Not worn down by time, scratched off on purpose by someone who wanted that particular Vestal forgotten. We will come back to why later in this story. For now, just notice that even inside a house, built to honour devotion and discipline, there was already a quiet warning carved into the stonework about what happened when someone failed. At the head of this household was a single woman, the chief Vestal known in Latin as the Virgo Vestalis Maxima. She was not a queen or a magistrate, but within those walls her authority was nearly absolute, second only to the Pontifex Maximus himself. She ran the day-to-day training of every new arrival, decided when a novice was ready to take on real responsibility, and quietly kept watch for the smallest signs of trouble long before anyone outside the atrium ever noticed anything was wrong. Only 6 women held the title of Vestal at any one time, spanning every stage of that 30-year structure at once, which meant that Amata's household, her entire world, now was not a school in the way we would picture one today. It was closer to a small, strange, tightly bound family, made up of near strangers ranging from girls just as young and frightened as she was, all the way up to women in their final decade of service who had seen more of Rome's private religious life than almost anyone else alive. Some ancient writers describe real warmth between them, women who witnessed each other's will, stood beside each other for decades, effectively becoming each other's only real family for the rest of their lives. Others suggest the senior Vestals could be sharp, exacting, occasionally merciless toward the younger ones learning under them. Honestly, that tracks. Put 6 people from wildly different ages and backgrounds into one enclosed household for 3 decades at a stretch, and you're going to get both. The tenderness and the tension often from the very same relationship. Try to picture one specific evening in that courtyard if you can. A girl of perhaps 8 or 9 sitting cross-legged near the reflecting pool, repeating the same 15 words of a ritual formula out loud, over and over, while a woman twice her age corrects her pronunciation without a hint of gentleness in her voice. Not out of cruelty necessarily, out of the simple cold understanding that this same girl would one day be standing in front of the entire city, performing that exact formula with absolutely no room for a mistake. That is not the kind of teaching that feels good in the moment. It rarely is. And outside those walls, life in Rome carried on entirely without her. Old friends she might have known before that morning in the forum grew up, got engaged, started families of their own, all while Amata sat cross-legged beside a pool, repeating 15 words until they stopped feeling like words at all. I wonder sometimes whether she noticed that gap opening up year by year between the childhood she might have had and the one she actually got, or whether inside a household built entirely around ritual and repetition, Time simply moved differently, and she never quite thought to measure it against anyone else's. Now, what were they actually teaching her? For one, basic literacy itself. That alone deserves a pause because it was not a small thing. Most Roman girls outside this order received little to no formal education at all, and were often married off by the time they reached their early teenage years, sometimes younger. A martyr instead was taught to make sense of written words at all, and then to recite long, precise ritual formulas from memory word for word, because Roman religion took the exact wording of a prayer astonishingly seriously. If a priest stumbled over even a single syllable during an official sacrifice, the entire ceremony could be declared invalid and had to start completely over from the beginning, sometimes with an additional sacrifice thrown in just to apologize to the gods for the interruption. Picture that kind of pressure resting on a girl who a few years earlier could not have told you what half those words even meant. Think about what that must have actually looked like in practice too. A general and entire army assembled behind him, standing at an altar the morning before marching off to war, waiting on a formula that only made sense if every single syllable landed exactly right. One slip of the tongue and the whole enormous, expensive, heavily armed procedure had to pause, while someone started the sacrifice over from the very beginning. Somewhere in the background of scenes like that quietly stood the training a martyr was receiving right now, because precision like that does not appear out of nowhere the day it is needed. It gets built syllable by syllable years in advance by a child sitting beside an unimpressed older woman in a courtyard saying the same 15 words until she could no longer get them wrong even if she tried. She was also taught to weave specifically the sacred garments and veils worn inside Vesta's temple, stitched by hand under careful supervision until the technique became second nature. And she learned something far more physically demanding than either of those: how to fetch water. This sounds almost laughably simple until you hear the actual rule attached to it. Vestals were required to draw their ritual water from one particular natural spring, not from any of the aqueducts running conveniently through the city. And once that water was collected, the vessel carrying it could not be set down, not even for a second, not to rest a tired arm, not to adjust a slipping grip, all the way back to the temple. Just imagine being handed that instruction as a small child, carrying something heavy across busy, uneven Roman streets, knowing that putting it down even briefly meant you had failed at the one simple task you were given that morning. I like to imagine her first real attempt at it going badly, honestly, because that feels more true to life than any version where a child gets it perfect on the first try. Arms shaking about halfway home, the temptation to just rest the jar on a low wall for a moment, just one moment, surely nobody would notice. And then noticing somehow that someone always did notice, because that was rather the entire point of the exercise. It is such a small, almost invisible kind of training, and yet it teaches you everything about what this entire institution valued. Not talent, not brilliance. Endurance, precision, and the ability to keep going exactly when nobody would notice if you quietly gave up for just a moment. And then there was the flour. Several times a year, tied to specific festivals throughout the Roman calendar, the Vestals ground sacred grain by hand and mixed it with salt to create something called mola salsa, a simple salted cake that sounds almost unremarkable until you learn where it actually ended up. That exact cake made by their own hands was sprinkled over the horns of nearly every animal sacrificed in an official Roman public ceremony all year long across the entire city, which means somewhere behind almost every major religious event in Rome, every triumph, every state sacrifice, every ceremony meant to keep the gods satisfied with the empire, sat a small, unglamorous batch of flour and salt, prepared by a handful of women most citizens would never personally meet. If you ever wanted a single image that captures how much quiet, invisible labour actually held Roman religion together, I would argue it is that. Not the marble, not the parades. A few women grinding grain in a back room, making sure an empire's relationship with its gods did not quietly fall apart over a missing ingredient. Amata's whole year, in fact, moved to a rhythm most ordinary Romans barely noticed existed. Certain weeks meant grinding grain for one festival. Certain weeks meant fresh garments woven for another. And for one particular stretch, each June, something rather unusual happened. For most of the year, the inner sanctuary of Vesta's temple was closed entirely to anyone outside the order. No exceptions, not for senators, not for generals. But for roughly a week and a half in June during the festival known as the Vestalia, that door opened and ordinary Roman wives and mothers were allowed inside barefoot to bring offerings and ask Vesta's blessing over their own households. For those few days, the goddess of the state hearth and the goddess of 1,000 individual kitchen fires became quite literally the exact same room. It is a small window into how differently Rome understood devotion. Most of the year sealed off, mysterious, guarded by 6 women nobody outside really knew, and then briefly open to absolutely anyone willing to walk in with bare feet and an offering. There was one more responsibility tucked inside that decade of training, and it connects directly back to something we talked about earlier. Remember that old story about Aeneas fleeing burning Troy with a small statue of the goddess Athena in his arms? Roman tradition held that this exact object, the Palladium, ended up locked away inside Vesta's temple, and the Vestals were its guardians. No outsider was permitted to lay eyes on it. Not senators, not generals, not even most priests. Nobody knows even now exactly what the object actually was physically, or how it survived centuries of fires and rebuilding inside a temple that burned down more than once. Its real power came from precisely that mystery, from the fact that almost nobody in Rome had ever seen it, and everybody still believed their entire city's safety somehow depended on it being kept safe in the dark by 6 women nobody outside that temple truly understood either. Can you imagine being handed that particular secret at 10 or 11 years old? Not a chore, not a formula to memorize, but an actual object, ancient beyond anyone's real knowledge, that an entire city had quietly agreed to trust you with sight unseen, no questions asked. That is an enormous amount of weight to hand a child. And yet, as far as we can tell from what survives of the historical record generation after generation of these girls simply carried it without complaint, without ever once revealing what they had seen. Here is the question I keep circling back to whenever I look through all of this. Was Amata being punished during those 10 years, or was she in a strange, uncomfortable way receiving one of the most rigorous educations available to any young person in the ancient world, regardless of gender? Because by the time most Roman girls her age were being prepared for marriage and childbirth, Amata was becoming fluently literate, memorizing complex ritual lore, managing sacred property, and carrying out precise technical duties that required real, sustained discipline. I am not telling you which way to feel about that. I honestly think it sits somewhere uncomfortable in the middle, and I would rather leave it there than pretend there is a tidy answer. Somewhere in the middle of that decade, something quieter was happening too, underneath all the formulas and the water jars and the grain. The version of herself that used to complain about a too tight braid was slowly being replaced by someone else entirely, someone steadier, someone who had learned to sit perfectly still through long ceremonies, someone whose voice no longer wavered on the 15th repetition of a prayer the way it had on the first. Nobody sat her down and announced that the change had happened. It rarely works that way, does it? You just wake up one ordinary morning years into something difficult, and realize the person doing the task is not quite the same person who started it. Maybe you had someone like that in your own life, come to think of it. Someone who pushed you through something truly difficult, held you to a standard that felt almost unfair at the time, and only years later did you understand they were quietly building something in you that you could not have built on your own. Rome just happened to build an entire religious institution around that exact idea and started the process at 6 years old. By the end of that first decade, Amata was no longer the small blinking child who stood barefoot in the forum, watching her mother's braid disappear into a stranger's fist. She could recite entire ceremonies from memory without a single mistake. She could weave. She could carry water across the length of the city without once letting her arms shake enough to spill it. And now at last she was being handed the one duty this entire story keeps circling back to, the responsibility every single thing she had learned so far was actually preparing her for. Not simply helping to tend the flame under careful supervision anymore, the way a novice does, watched closely at every step. From this point forward, on certain nights, that fire would be hers alone to guard in a temple with no walls thick enough to fully block out a Roman winter, and no room whatsoever for the kind of small human mistake that had once made a general's entire army wait at an altar. No room whatsoever for the kind of small human mistake that had once made a general's entire army wait at an altar. So let's slow down and actually sit inside that responsibility for a while, because I think most versions of this story rush straight past the part that mattered most to the women actually living it. Tending the sacred fire did not look like anything dramatic most nights. No grand ceremony, no crowd watching. It looked like sitting beside a hearth in a quiet round room, feeding it the right amount of the right kind of wood, at the right intervals, over and over for hours at a stretch. Rome was strict about even that small detail, by the way. This fire could not be fed with just any timber someone happened to have lying around. Certain hardwoods were considered proper fuel, and others were not, and the wood itself had to be sourced and kept with the same care as everything else inside that temple. Because this was never simply a fire. It was Vesta herself in the only form anyone ever saw her take, and you do not feed a goddess whatever happens to be sitting in the woodpile. Think about what that actually means for a moment on a purely practical level. Somewhere outside the temple, someone had the ongoing job of locating chopping seasoning and delivering the correct kind of wood to a building where it would be burned in front of nobody for a fire most citizens never personally stood beside in their entire lives. An enormous amount of quiet labour invisible to almost everyone existed, purely to keep one small flame properly fed. That is, in a strange way, the whole story of the Vestals in a single sentence. Enormous effort, almost entirely unseen, holding up something the whole city depended on, without ever really thinking about how it worked. At least one Vestal was required to be present at that hearth at every single hour, day and night, which meant the 6 of them worked out something resembling a rotation, an ancient version of a night shift passed quietly between women who had spent years learning exactly how to do this without complaint. Picture Amata now a few years further into her service, sitting alone in that round room, somewhere around the middle of the night, the rest of the city finally gone quiet outside. No crowd, no priest watching over her shoulder, just her, a small fire, and the specific kind of silence that only exists in a city built for over 1 million people once every single one of them has finally gone to sleep. I think about that silence a lot, honestly, because most of what we remember about the Vestals involves the dramatic parts, the punishments, the privileges, the scandal. Almost nobody stops to picture the actual texture of the job itself, which was for enormous stretches of time simply this: sitting still, staying awake, watching a small flame do absolutely nothing interesting, hour after hour, knowing that the one time something did happen, it would define the rest of your life. Outside, somewhere across the forum, a stray dog might bark once and go quiet again. A watchman's footsteps might echo off stone for a moment and fade. And through all of it, one small room stayed lit, holding perfectly still, against a city that had for a few hours mostly stopped moving. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Have you ever held a responsibility like that, something nobody was watching you do, where the only real consequence of failing would show up quietly later, in a way nobody could immediately trace back to you? It is a strange, specific kind of pressure, the kind that never announces itself with an audience. Just you and the thing you are trusted to protect. Winter watches were the worst, if I had to guess. Rome does get cold, truly cold, some years, and that vent cut into the roof meant to let smoke escape, also let plenty of outside air pour straight back in. A Vestal, on the overnight rotation in the middle of a January frost, was not doing some peaceful meditative task by a cosy fire. She was fighting a losing battle against the weather itself, feeding the flame just a little more aggressively than usual, wrapping her own arms tighter around her shoulders, watching her breath fog in front of her face inside a supposedly sacred room. Summer nights, by comparison, probably felt almost gentle. I imagine some of the six actually came to prefer the job in July if such a preference was even allowed to exist quietly in someone's own head. Not every Vestal experienced this duty the same way, I would guess. Some likely found something resembling peace in it eventually, a strange, private kind of stillness nobody outside that room ever got to witness. Others probably counted down the years until this exact task belonged to someone younger than them. Now here is where I think the story gets more interesting than the myth alone lets on. Because underneath all the religious weight the Romans piled onto this fire, there was also something almost embarrassingly practical going on. Nobody in ancient Rome had a match. Striking flint against steel worked technically, but it was slow, unreliable, and truly difficult in damp weather, which Rome had plenty of. A permanently burning public fire sitting right in the middle of the city was not just a symbol, it was infrastructure. If your own hearth ever went cold through carelessness or bad luck, or a long trip away from home, there was quite literally one dependable place in the entire city where fire always existed and could always be carried home, ember by careful ember tucked into a covered clay pot for the walk back through the streets. The gods got the credit, but underneath the religion sat a remarkably clever piece of civic planning hiding in plain sight. Somewhere in the back of my mind I like picturing an ordinary Roman household, a family running late for dinner because a sudden rainstorm soaked their firewood and drowned their own hearth completely. Someone's teenage son gets sent running across half the city clay pot in hand straight to the one place fire is always guaranteed to exist, no matter the weather, no matter the hour. A small errand probably run without a second thought, resting entirely on the fact that 6 women somewhere in that round temple had not once let their own fire fail. Which makes what happened once a year even stranger if you think about it. Because there was exactly one day when Rome deliberately let that fire go out on purpose. The Roman calendar, before later reforms rearranged it, began its year in March, not January. And on the first day of that month the Vestals extinguished the sacred flame themselves entirely on purpose, and then rebuilt it completely from nothing. Not lit from a candle, not carried over from embers kept warm somewhere else, struck fresh from friction alone by drilling into a plank of wood cut from a tree, the Romans considered especially fortunate. Picture the actual motion of it for a second, hands, raw shoulders aching, spinning a wooden drill against a groove, cut into that plank faster and faster, waiting for the first thread of smoke, then the first tiny coal cupped and fed and coaxed with painstaking patience into something that could finally be called fire again. It is, if you stop and picture it, an almost unbearably tense scene. An entire city for a few hours each year sitting without its one guaranteed source of fire, waiting on a handful of women rubbing wood against wood in a dark temple hoping it worked. Ancient writers describe something resembling a genuine citywide state of religious emergency. During that gap, an uneasy pause nobody quite exhaled through, until smoke finally curled up from that plank of wood. And if the fire ever did go dark outside of that one sanctioned moment, through nothing more than carelessness on an ordinary Tuesday, the punishment was swift physical and strangely private. The Vestal responsible was beaten by the Pontifex Maximus himself, but not in public, not in front of a crowd hungry for spectacle. It happened behind a curtain in near darkness, almost as if even Rome itself was not entirely comfortable watching what it demanded. Now here is the part I find almost darkly funny in the driest possible way. This entire order existed to prevent catastrophic fire from ever threatening Rome's safety. And the temple itself, the actual physical building housing the one flame that was never supposed to go dark, burned down, more than once. The first time back in the earliest days of the Republic, an invading Gallic army swept through the city and left much of Rome, including that original shrine, in ashes. Centuries later, in the middle years of the Republic, the temple caught fire again, and this time a specific remarkable man stepped directly into that story. The high priest at the time, a man named Caecilius Metellus, ran into the burning building to save that same mysterious palladium we talked about, the one almost nobody was ever allowed to see. He got it out. He also, according to the accounts that survive, lost his eyesight doing it. Whether from the flames themselves or the smoke, we cannot say for certain, this far removed from the event. Think about that for a moment. A man risking permanent blindness to rescue an object he was not even supposed to look at in the first place, because what mattered was not what it was, but that it survived. Rome remembered him for it too, which tells you something about where its priorities truly sat. Not comfort, not safety, continuity at almost any personal cost. The temple burned again generations later in the Great Fire that tore through Rome under Nero, and once more roughly 2 centuries after that before finally being rebuilt for what turned out to be the last time by an empress named Julia Domna. Every single time Rome simply started over, rebuilt the round walls, relit the flame, kept going as if stopping had truly never once occurred to them as an option. There is something almost stubborn about that pattern, if you ask me. An entire civilization repeatedly proving to itself that whatever burned down could always be rebuilt, as long as somebody was still willing to strike the wood again. Let's go back to a martyr for a moment on one particular night that probably felt like every other night right up until it didn't. A sudden gust of cold night air slips through that vent cut into the roof, the same vent letting the smoke escape, and the flame gutters dips low, nearly disappears entirely for one full silent second. Her heart would have dropped straight through the floor, in that instant I imagine, faster than her hands could even react. No priest standing nearby, no one to call for help even if she wanted to. Just her own body curving instinctively around that small light shielding it, with nothing more than her own shoulders and the edge of her cloak holding perfectly still until it steadies again, breath held watching that thin orange line climb back up the wick of flame it had almost lost entirely. Nobody writes songs about moments like that. There is no crowd to applaud her for it. But that single, unremarkable, unwitnessed second, repeated 1,000 times across 30 years by 6 different women taking their turns in the dark, is honestly the entire reason this story survived long enough for either of us to be talking about it tonight. If you have ever kept something alive that nobody else was watching, a relationship, a small business, a sick parent, a fragile idea, nobody else believed in, yet you already understand something true about what that particular kind of vigilance costs a person. Rome just happened to build an entire empire's peace of mind around one very specific, very literal version of that exact feeling. And honestly, can we talk for a second about the sheer audacity of assigning that particular job to a child in the first place? Somewhere in Rome, a general could lose an entire legion in a poorly planned campaign and still eventually get a second command. A senator could vote for a truly terrible policy and still keep his seat for another decade. But a 14-year-old girl half asleep on a January watch, allowing one careless moment to snuff out a fire-faced consequences the generals and senators never had to seriously worry about for their own mistakes. Rome trusted its women with an almost impossible standard, and simultaneously refused to trust them with nearly anything else. That contradiction sat at the centre of this entire institution quietly for over 1,000 years. It is worth pointing out too that nothing about this responsibility ever got easier with practice the way most jobs do. A blacksmith gets faster at his trade with every passing year. A merchant learns to spot a bad deal before it costs him anything, but tending this particular fire never stopped requiring full attention, not after 1 year, not after 20. Familiarity was never allowed to soften into carelessness, because the entire point of the arrangement was that it could not. Every single watch carried the exact same weight as the very first one, whether it was a martyr's 100th night by that hearth or her 1,000th. We still do versions of this today if you think about it, even in a world absolutely full of matches and lighters and electric everything. Cities keep flames burning at war memorials specifically so they never go out. Olympic organisers spend weeks passing one small fire hand to hand across entire continents before a single race has even started. Something in us apparently has never fully let go of the idea that a flame kept alive deliberately, without interruption, means something more than the simple chemistry of it. Rome just handed that particular emotional weight to 6 specific women and asked them to carry it for 30 years apiece, one quiet, unwitnessed night at a time. But here is the thing about a responsibility this enormous. Rome did not simply ask a 6-year-old girl to carry it and offer nothing back in return. In exchange for years of nights like that, one sitting alone by a flame that could never be allowed to fail, a martyr was about to receive a set of privileges so far beyond what any other woman in the entire empire could expect, that most Romans, if they are honest, found the whole arrangement almost impossible to fully make sense of. So far beyond what any other woman in the entire empire could expect that most Romans, if they are honest, found the whole arrangement almost impossible to fully make sense of. And honestly, neither do I some days when I sit with just how strange this particular trade actually was. Let's start with something as simple as walking down the street, because even that looked completely different for a Vestal than it did for every other woman in Rome. Most Roman women moved through the city on foot, or tucked away inside a closed litter, if their family could afford one largely invisible, largely unremarkable to the crowd around them. A Vestal, by contrast, rode through the city in an open 2-wheeled carriage, called a carpentum, with an armed escort walking directly in front of her, clearing the way. That escort, by the way, was not just some hired muscle. It was a lictor, the exact same kind of official attendant who normally walked in front of consuls and magistrates' men, holding actual political power over the Roman state. A 6-year-old girl from a good family had been transformed over the course of a single afternoon in the Forum years earlier into someone the city physically rearranged itself around. Try picturing the sound of it for a second, because I think that helps more than the visual alone. Wooden wheels rattling over old stone, a lictor's footsteps setting a steady, unhurried pace, Just ahead of the carriage, and underneath all of it, the particular hush that falls over a crowded street the instant people realize exactly who is approaching. Not the noisy excitement of a parade, something quieter, closer to held breath. And that arrangement was not just for show either. If someone jostled a Vestal in the street, shoved her even carelessly, or if a driver failed to pull his cart aside quickly enough when her carriage approached, the consequences were not a fine or a stern warning. They could be put to death for it. Think about what that actually does to a crowd, practically speaking. Picture the ripple moving through a packed Roman street the instant someone spotted that carriage approaching people, physically flattening themselves against walls, pulling children out of the road, an entire street reorganizing itself in seconds around one woman's presence out of something closer to genuine dread than simple courtesy. Roman law had a specific word for that kind of protected status, incidentally one that shows up in a slightly different form in English even now. They considered a Vestal sacrosanct, meaning quite literally made sacred, and therefore untouchable. She was not simply respected the way you might respect a well-known public figure today. Under Roman religious thinking, she belonged in some very real legal sense to the goddess herself, and harming her was treated less like a crime against one particular person, and more like an offence against Vesta directly against the entire arrangement holding the city's safety together. That is an enormous amount of protection to build around one individual, and it becomes a little easier to understand once you remember what everyone believed she was actually guarding on Rome's behalf. Here's a question worth pausing on for a second. Can you think of anyone in your own life today who commands that kind of instant physical deference just by entering a room, not requesting it, not earning it through some obvious display of power, simply having it automatically the moment people recognize who they're looking at? That same untouchable status followed her into public entertainment too, and this is the detail I find most quietly fascinating out of everything we have covered so far. At the games, at gladiatorial contests and chariot races, ordinary Roman women were pushed to the very back of the seating, up in the highest, cheapest, least desirable rows, often too far away to see much of anything clearly. Vestals sat in the front row, not near the front, the actual front facing the arena directly in seats of honour, typically reserved for senators and magistrates and the most important men in Rome. For a few hours in that one specific location, a Vestal occupied physical space that no other woman in the entire empire was permitted to occupy, sitting shoulder to shoulder with the men who ran the state, while thousands of other Roman women watched the exact same event from what amounted to the cheap seats, straining to see past everyone in front of them. It is honestly the ancient equivalent of front row tickets nobody else could buy at any price, courtesy weirdly of decades spent guarding a fire nobody was allowed to actually see put out. I want you to sit with that image for a second because I think it says more about Roman priorities than almost any law on the books could. This was not a society confused about whether women could hold status. It clearly understood status perfectly well. It simply decided quite deliberately that almost no woman would be allowed to have it, except for a small handful who had given up marriage, motherhood, and their own name in exchange. I imagine there was a specific kind of loneliness folded into that seat too, honestly sitting front and centre at some of the loudest, most crowded public events in Rome, surrounded by senators, rather than by anyone who actually knew her personally, visible to absolutely everyone, known intimately by almost no one in that entire arena. There is a particular kind of isolation that only shows up in a crowd, and I suspect a Vestal understood that feeling better than most. Now here is where the story gets truly strange, because Vestals were not just symbolically powerful. They occasionally held the kind of practical, real-world power that could alter the direction of actual events, and I want to walk you through two examples that rarely make it into the shorter version of this story. The first happened generations before a martyr's time, but it echoes forward through the rest of Roman history in a way that is honestly hard to overstate. During a brutal period of political purges, a young, still relatively unknown Roman named Julius Caesar found himself placed on a death list by the dictator Sulla, mostly for refusing to divorce his wife when ordered to. Caesar went into hiding, moving from house to house some nights, according to the accounts that survive, while men loyal to Sulla actively hunted for him across the city. And according to Roman tradition, it was the Vestal Virgins, among a handful of other influential figures, who successfully interceded on his behalf and secured his pardon. Sulla reportedly gave in, reluctantly warning the people around him, almost as an afterthought, that they were sparing a young man who would one day be the ruin of everyone currently celebrating his mercy. Just sit with that for a moment. The man who would eventually cross the Rubicon, reshape the entire Roman Republic, and set in motion the chain of events that led directly to the Roman Empire, was as a young man one accidental execution away from never accomplishing any of it. And a small group of women tending a fire in a round temple may have quietly been the reason history got to happen the way it did at all. The second story involves an object rather than a person, but the stakes were, if anything, even higher. Vestals were trusted to physically hold onto the wills of Rome's most powerful citizens, locked away inside their temple, considered so secure and so beyond suspicion that even Julius Caesar himself deposited his personal will there. Decades later, so did Mark Antony, and in the tense, dangerous years leading up to the final showdown between Antony and Octavian, the young man who would eventually become the Emperor Augustus did something almost unthinkable. He marched to the temple and demanded Antony's will from the Vestals directly. They initially refused him by all accounts, citing the sacred private nature of what they held. Octavian pressed the issue anyway, and eventually walked away with the document. He then recited it aloud publicly in front of the Senate, revealing that Antony intended to be buried not in Rome but in Egypt beside Cleopatra. It was by any measure a devastating piece of political theatre, and it worked exactly as intended, turning Roman public opinion firmly against a man many still considered technically a fellow Roman leader rather than a foreign threat. I find that story almost unbearably telling, if I am honest with you. An institution built entirely around trust, privacy, and sacred discretion was in one of the most consequential political moments in Roman history, forced open by a young man who understood exactly how much power that discretion actually held and was willing to violate it anyway to win an empire. It says something rather uncomfortable too about how far even the most sacred institutions in Rome could bend the instant enough political ambition pressed against them. The Vestals were untouchable right up until the single most ambitious man in Rome decided quietly and calmly that they were not. There is a smaller, quieter example of this same influence surviving well into the imperial period, too long after the Republic had already collapsed into something new. A Vestal named Junia Torquata successfully pleaded on behalf of her own brother after he was condemned for treason years into the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, a ruler not exactly famous for warmth or leniency toward anyone who crossed him. Her intervention did not erase the charge entirely, but it visibly softened his punishment at a moment in Roman history when publicly disagreeing with an emperor's judgment could be a dangerous thing for almost anyone else to attempt. Senators who challenged Tiberius directly sometimes paid for it with their lives. A Vestal apparently could still say something out loud that nobody else in that room would have dared to. And then there was the single strangest privilege of all, the one that still catches people off guard when they hear it for the first time. If a condemned prisoner being marched through the streets toward execution happened to cross paths with a Vestal along the way purely by chance, that prisoner could be pardoned on the spot. Not appealed, not reviewed by a court. Pardoned immediately simply because the Vestal declared in that moment that the meeting had been an accident rather than something arranged in advance. Picture the sheer improbability required for that particular rule to ever matter in practice. A guard leading a prisoner along one specific street on one specific morning, at the exact moment a Vestal happens to be riding through on entirely unrelated business. It sounds almost too rare to matter, and honestly it probably was rare. But that is not really the point, is it? The point is that Rome built an actual functioning escape hatch into its own justice system, one that depended entirely on chance, and handed the key to that escape hatch to 6 women who otherwise had no formal role in criminal law whatsoever. It is such a strange, almost fairy tale kind of mercy dropped into the middle of an otherwise fairly brutal legal system. Think about the 2 people standing at the centre of that improbable moment for a second. A condemned man resigned to whatever came next, dragged along a familiar route toward an ending he had already made peace with, in whatever way a person manages to make peace with something like that. And a young woman on an unrelated errand riding past in a carriage who suddenly holds his entire remaining life in a single sentence she's not even planned to say yet. Neither of them chose that intersection. Rome simply decided that when it happened it meant something, and both of them had to carry whatever it decided next. Maybe that is worth asking yourself too. If you were given one single unpredictable moment of mercy you could hand to a complete stranger once with no explanation required beyond your own word being trusted, absolutely would you even recognize the moment when it arrived? So let's take stock of everything Amata now actually had at this point in her story. A carriage, an armed escort, a front row seat beside senators, the power to alter a will that could sway an entire empire's politics, and on rare occasion, the power to save a stranger's life with nothing more than a single sentence. It is an extraordinary list by any honest measure, and I do not want to undersell it because I think a lot of retellings rush straight past just how remarkable this actually was for a woman living in that era. If you had described that exact list of powers to any other Roman woman, a wealthy senator's wife, a merchant's daughter, most of them probably would have traded quite a lot to have even half of it. But here is the uncomfortable thread running underneath every single privilege on that list if you look closely enough. None of it belonged to her personally the way privilege usually works for the rest of us. She could not spend that status on a life of her own choosing. She could not use that influence to marry who she wanted, settle where she wanted, or simply walk away from any of it without consequence, not for 30 years. Every single one of those privileges existed specifically because she had given up the ordinary right to make basic decisions about her own life. Rome was in its own strange contradictory way, both the most generous and the most controlling institution a Roman woman could possibly encounter, often within the very same afternoon. It reminds me a little of certain modern arrangements, honestly, if you squint at it sideways. Enormous privilege, extraordinary access, real influence over decisions most people never get near all of it, handed over in exchange for surrendering some fundamental piece of an ordinary life almost nobody else has to give up in return. Rome just happened to build its version of that bargain around a hearth fire and a 30-year vow instead of a contract and a signature. And all of it, every carriage ride, every front row seat, every pardoned stranger rested on one single unforgiving condition that we have not fully discussed yet. One quiet, absolute rule that the moment it was even suspected of being broken could turn every last one of those privileges into nothing at all faster than anyone standing in that crowded street could possibly imagine. Faster than anyone standing in that crowded street could possibly imagine. So let's actually name that rule, because I think most people who have heard the phrase before have never actually sat with what it truly demanded of a person. The Romans called it incestum. And before you picture anything modern that word might bring to mind, let's clear that up right away, because it truly trips people up. In this context, incestum simply meant a vestal's broken vow of chastity, nothing more specific than that. Not a family relationship, not anything else English speakers might automatically assume when they hear a word that looks so familiar. Just this one single absolute condition, the entire foundation, everything else in her extraordinary life was quietly built on top of. Worth clearing up early, because I would rather you spend the next few minutes thinking about the actual history, instead of a false assumption planted by a coincidence of language. Here is the part that took me a while to really understand though, and I think it is the key to this whole chapter of her story. Rome did not think of a Vestal's virginity as a private personal matter, the way most of us would think about it today. They believed it was directly physically tied to the safety of the entire city. If a Vestal broke that vow, the thinking went, it did not just damage her own reputation, or her own soul. It cracked something in the barrier protecting Rome itself, the same barrier that fire and ritual and 30 years of unbroken discipline were meant to keep sealed shut. Her body, in a very real sense, the Romans actually believed was doing the same job as the flame she tended. Something had to stay intact, unbroken, untouched, or the whole city stood exposed to whatever disaster came next. It is a strange kind of logic if you have never encountered it before, but it was not random superstition invented on a whim. It came from the exact same worldview we talked about earlier, the belief that Rome's entire relationship with its gods depended on an unbroken chain of correct behavior, correct ritual, correct devotion. A misspoken prayer could ruin a sacrifice. An extinguished flame could threaten the whole city. In that same framework, a broken vow was simply one more crack in a wall Rome desperately needed to believe was solid, permanent, and entirely under its control. Think about the sheer weight that puts on one person for a second, not just staying chaste. Truly believing that an entire empire's fortune in war harvest and health depended on that one unbroken condition, holding steady year after year, decade after decade. And here is where the story gets truly unsettling, because it was never enough simply to be innocent. A Vestal also had to appear innocent constantly in every visible detail of how she carried herself, and Rome was not shy about enforcing that second, far vaguer standard. Part of the problem, if we can call it that, was how truly difficult this particular accusation was to prove one way or the other. There was no reliable objective test available to the pontiffs handling these cases, nothing they considered both accurate and appropriately respectful of a sacred priestess's body. What they had instead was testimony. Rumour essentially dressed up in formal legal language. A slave with a grudge, a jealous rival, a neighbour who noticed a man lingering too long near the wrong door, any of it could set an investigation in motion, and once it started, a Vestal's fate rested almost entirely on how convincing that testimony sounded to the specific men judging her that particular year. Let me tell you about a Vestal named Postumia, because her story captures this better than almost anything else I've come across. Sometime around the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era, Postumia found herself formally accused of incestum. Not because anyone had actual evidence against her, not because a witness came forward with anything specific. She was accused because, according to the Roman historian who recorded her case, she dressed more elegantly than a Vestal was supposed to, and she had, in his words, a sharper, livelier wit than seemed proper for a young woman in her position. That was it. That was the entire basis for a trial that could quite literally have ended with her being buried alive. Picture what that must have actually felt like from the inside for a moment. Waking up one morning as a young woman who simply enjoyed a nicely made dress and a clever remark, and by evening standing accused of a capital offence entirely on the strength of other people's discomfort with your personality. No secret lover produced, no slave testifying against her, just a room full of powerful men deciding that a woman who seemed too pleased with herself must be hiding something. She was acquitted eventually when the actual evidence, or rather the complete absence of it, became clear even to the men judging her. But the Pontifex Maximus did not simply let her walk away without comment. He gave her on behalf of the entire College of Priests a formal warning to stop making jokes and to start dressing with, and I am paraphrasing him only slightly here, considerably more regard for holiness and considerably less regard for looking nice. Sit with that outcome for a moment. A woman who broke no actual rule was still functionally punished, just more gently than the alternative. Told in front of witnesses to make herself smaller, quieter, plainer, less noticeable, because being noticed at all had apparently been the real offence. Here's something worth asking yourself honestly. Have you ever been criticised less for anything you actually did, and more for simply being too visible, too confident, too much yourself in a room full of people who'd already decided what a woman in your position should look like? Now here is the detail that makes Postumia's story so much darker in hindsight, because she was not the only Vestal accused for almost exactly this same reason. Decades later, a different Vestal named Minutia attracted suspicion, using nearly identical language to what Livy used to describe Postumia. Too elegant a wardrobe, too much attention drawn to herself. In Minutia's case, though, that initial suspicion did not simply fade away after a formal scolding, it escalated. A household slave eventually came forward with testimony against her, and that testimony was enough to tip the outcome entirely in the other direction. Minutia was found guilty and executed in the specific terrible way we will talk about in detail very soon. 2 women. Nearly the exact same starting accusation. Completely different endings decided by circumstances almost entirely outside either woman's own control. Whether a slave happened to have a grudge or a debt, or a promise of freedom dangling in front of them in exchange for testimony. Whether a particular judge that year leaned toward mercy or toward severity. Whether Rome at that specific moment happened to be calm or desperate. That more than almost anything else I can tell you about this institution captures just how unpredictable and truly dangerous it was to exist inside that particular spotlight for 30 consecutive years. It also raises an uncomfortable question about what actually kept the 6 of them safe, doesn't it? Not virtue alone, clearly, since virtue alone did not save Minutia. Something closer to luck timing and the particular mood of the men judging you on any given year. I imagine that reality settled into every Vestal's mind eventually, whether anyone ever said it out loud inside those walls or not. You could do everything correctly, exactly as instructed for 30 straight years, and still, depending entirely on circumstances you could never predict, end up standing exactly where Minutia once stood. There is one more detail worth mentioning here because it tells you something about how differently Rome treated the 2 people supposedly involved in any given accusation. If a man was identified as the Vestal's alleged partner, his punishment was severe, make no mistake, a public beating that ended in death. But it was quick compared to what awaited her. His sentence lasted minutes. Hers, as we're about to see, was built to stretch out for what must have felt like an eternity, by comparison wrapped in ceremony, procession, and ritual, almost as though Rome needed her punishment to carry symbolic weight his never had to. Because here is the pattern underneath both of those stories, and once you notice it, you cannot really unsee it anywhere else in Roman history. Accusations against Vestals rarely appeared out of nowhere, drifting in on some quiet, uneventful year. They tended to cluster around moments when Rome itself was already in crisis, looking almost desperately for some explanation for why its fortunes had suddenly turned. The clearest example of this happened in the aftermath of one of the worst military defeats in Roman history. In the year 216 before the Common Era, a Roman army was annihilated by the Carthaginian general Hannibal at a battle called Cannae, a catastrophe so total that Rome truly feared for a while that the war itself might already be lost. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon, entire families losing every man they had sent off to fight. The city understandably fell into something resembling collective panic, the kind that makes people search desperately for a reason, any reason why the gods had apparently turned their backs. In that panic and superstitious dread, 2 Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were accused of incestum and found guilty. One took her own life before her sentence could be carried out. The other was buried alive at the city gate exactly as tradition demanded. Whether either woman had actually broken her vow, we truly cannot know for certain, this far removed from the event. What we can say with real confidence is that Rome, staring down a national catastrophe, needed somewhere to direct that fear, and 2 women guarding a fire in a quiet temple became almost overnight a convenient place to put it. It happened again roughly a century later, and this time the trigger was even stranger. A woman was struck and killed by lightning, her body left exposed by the blast, in a way Romans considered deeply unnatural and ominous. She had no connection whatsoever to the Temple of Vesta, no relationship to any of the 6 women serving there, and yet rather than treating her death as simple, tragic bad luck, the event was interpreted as a sign, a divine warning, that somewhere quietly a Vestal had broken her vow. That single unrelated tragedy set off a formal investigation that eventually swept up 3 separate Vestals, ending in more than one execution. I find that particular detail almost impossible to shake off honestly. An accident of weather, a woman killed by lightning who had nothing whatsoever to do with the Temple of Vesta, ended up deciding the fate of 3 completely unrelated women simply because Rome needed the universe to make sense again, and blaming an unlucky bolt of lightning on pure chance apparently felt less bearable than blaming it on someone's hidden sin. There is a dark kind of comedy in that if you squint at it from enough distance. An entire legal investigation launched because the sky did something inconvenient on the wrong afternoon. There is something painfully familiar in that pattern if you step back far enough from the togas and the Latin names. A society under pressure looks for someone to blame, and it tends to reach again and again for whoever already stands in the most visible, most symbolically loaded position, whether or not that person actually did anything wrong at all. We still recognize that particular instinct today, honestly even dressed in completely different language and completely different institutions. Rome just happened to build an entire religious office around exactly that kind of visibility, and then acted surprised decade after decade when the fear of the whole city kept landing on the same 6 women. Can you imagine carrying that particular kind of dread for 30 years? Not fear of your own mistake necessarily, though that alone would be exhausting enough on its own. Fear that a stranger's bad luck, a lightning strike hundreds of miles from anything you had ever done, a battle lost by generals you had never even met could suddenly turn an entire city's grief and fury directly toward you. For no reason you could control, predict or defend yourself against in advance. I wonder too what that constant low-grade threat did to the small household of 6 women actually living together inside the Atrium Vestae. Did they watch each other a little more closely than warmth alone would explain, aware that one woman's mistake, real or invented, could put the entire order under suspicion at once? Did friendships form anyway in spite of it, or precisely because of it? 6 people bound together by a shared unspoken understanding of exactly how fragile their safety truly was. Ancient sources do not really tell us, which leaves that particular question sitting somewhere just out of reach, one of the quieter mysteries in a story, otherwise stuffed full of dramatic ones. I sometimes wonder a little grimly whether the safest Vestals in Roman history were not necessarily the most virtuous ones, but simply the ones lucky enough to serve during peaceful decades, when Rome had no urgent reason to go looking for someone to blame. Virtue, it turns out, was never quite enough on its own to guarantee safety. Timing mattered just as much, and nobody serving in that temple ever got to choose which 30 years of Roman history they happened to be born into. And that brings us to the part of this story most people are actually waiting for, if I am honest, the part with the harshest reputation of all. Because when a Vestal was found guilty, when suspicion finally hardened into an official verdict, Rome did not simply execute her the way it executed everyone else. It built an entire elaborate, almost theatrical ritual around her death, instead one specifically designed to satisfy religious law without technically spilling a single drop of sacred blood, a ritual so strange, so deliberately choreographed, that it still manages to shock people hearing about it for the very first time 2,000 years later. That it still manages to shock people hearing about it for the very first time 2,000 years later. So let's actually walk through it slowly, because I think rushing past the details would honestly do a disservice to every woman who ever lived through it. Here is the problem Rome needed to solve first before we even get to the ritual itself. A Vestal's blood was considered sacred, which meant spilling it, even in an execution, was thought to pollute the entire city rather than cleanse it. You cannot behead someone whose blood you are religiously forbidden from shedding. You cannot stab her, poison her, or drown her either, since all of those methods carried the same problem. So Rome, in its own strange legalistic way, invented something else entirely. A method of killing a person that technically involved nobody actually killing her at all. It is worth pausing on how deeply strange that solution actually is once you say it out loud. Rome was perfectly capable of extraordinary violence when it wanted to be public executions, crucifixions, wild beasts in the arena, entire cities burned to the ground during conquest. None of that troubled the Roman conscience in any lasting way. But the specific technical detail of a Vestal's blood touching the ground apparently crossed a line nothing else in their entire legal system was willing to cross. So instead of simplicity, they built elaborate theatre, an entire ceremony engineered around one single narrow religious loophole. Before we get to how that method worked, it helps to know it was not always the method Rome used. According to the earliest layers of tradition, priestesses serving this same role, generations before Rome even existed, back in that older city of Alba Longa we talked about earlier, were simply whipped to death when they broke their vow. It was Tarquinius Priscus, one of Rome's early kings, who apparently decided that punishment needed replacing, and the very first Vestal buried alive under this new method was a priestess named Pinaria. From that point forward for the rest of Roman history, this became the fixed, unchanging procedure whenever a Vestal was found guilty. Whatever Tarquinius intended by the change, whether mercy spectacle or simple religious anxiety about spilled blood, Rome kept using his method for well over 800 years, without ever seriously revisiting it. Let's go back to Minutia for a moment, because I promised you her story, and I think walking through exactly what happened to her is the clearest way to understand this ritual as something that actually happened to an actual person, rather than a strange historical footnote. It is easy to talk about Roman punishments in the abstract numbers and dates and Latin terms. It is much harder and much more honest to sit with the fact that every single detail I am about to describe happened to a specific woman with a specific name who'd been a small child once, just like a martyr standing in that same forum waiting to be chosen. Has a story ever done that to you, by the way? Made something that felt purely historical, almost theoretical, suddenly feel uncomfortably near and real, simply because you finally slowed down enough to picture one actual person living through it. Once the pontiffs reached their verdict, the process began almost immediately. She was stripped of the vitae, the woven headbands marking her as a Vestal, along with every other visible symbol of her office. Some accounts describe a scourging carried out before the procession even started. She was then dressed deliberately in the clothing of a corpse, as though Rome wanted to skip straight past the idea of punishment and go directly to treating her as already dead. From there, she was placed inside a closed litter, its coverings fastened down tightly with cords sealed so completely that she could be neither seen nor heard by anyone outside it. Think about that specific detail for a second, because I find it almost more unsettling than anything else in this entire ritual. Not just hidden from view. Silence completely carried through a city that had until recently cleared the streets in her honor every single time her carriage approached. That litter was carried through the forum, through the same crowded public spaces where she had once ridden in triumph, dressed exactly like a funeral procession, complete with weeping relatives walking alongside it. The crowd that gathered to watch did not shout or jeer or celebrate. Every account that survives describes something closer to horrified total silence. An entire city watching one of its own be carried toward a death it had officially decided to pretend was not quite a death at all. Some of the very same people lining that route had probably flattened themselves against a wall years earlier to let her carriage pass in the opposite direction, back when jostling her in the street could have cost them their own lives. Now they stood in near total quiet watching the same woman carried toward a hole in the ground, and Roman law protected her just as fiercely in that final procession as it always had. Nobody was permitted to touch her. Nobody was permitted to interfere. The procession ended at a low ridge of raised earth near the Colline Gate on the northern edge of the city, a place the Romans called the Campus Sceleratus, which translates more or less to the field of wickedness. Underneath that ridge a small chamber had already been dug and prepared in advance, accessible only by a narrow set of steps leading down from the surface. And inside that chamber waiting for her was furniture, an actual bed with proper coverings, a lit oil lamp, small portions of bread, a bowl of water, some milk, a little oil, everything a person might need for an ordinary night's sleep arranged carefully in a room built specifically to become her grave. Sit with the strangeness of that image for a moment. Somebody, some ordinary Roman worker with a specific job to do that particular morning, carried a bed frame down a narrow set of steps into a hole in the ground. Somebody trimmed the wick on that lamp and made sure it was properly filled with the oil before anyone arrived. Somebody baked that bread, poured that milk into a bowl, and set it down carefully on a small table, the way you might set a table for a guest you were expecting home. All of it prepared in advance with the same practical, unhurried competence Romans brought to almost everything else they built. A tomb furnished like a bedroom by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and did it anyway because the paperwork, in a manner of speaking, required it. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly. Why go to all that trouble? Why furnish a tomb like a bedroom when everyone involved understood exactly what was actually happening? I think the honest answer says more about Rome's relationship with its own conscience than it does about the Vestal herself. Providing food and light let the priests tell themselves with a straight face that they had not actually killed her. She had simply been given everything she needed to go on living, they could argue, and whatever happened after that sealed chamber closed was technically out of their hands. It is one of the more transparent pieces of self-deception I have come across in all of Roman history, and also somehow one of the most human. People have always found ways to dress up the worst things they do in language soft enough to let them sleep at night. Rome just happened to formalize that instinct into an actual religious ritual with props and staging and a script everyone had memorized. Have you ever noticed how often cruelty gets easier to carry out once it has been given a gentler name or wrapped in enough procedure that nobody involved has to feel personally responsible for the outcome? I think that instinct is a lot more common and a lot more timeless than most of us would like to admit. The Pontifex Maximus himself performed the final part of the ceremony. He raised his hands toward the sky and spoke certain prayers, words considered too sacred or perhaps too uncomfortable to be openly recorded by the historians who described everything else about this ritual in such precise detail. He then opened the litter and led her out, still heavily veiled, and walked her to the top of the steps leading down into the chamber. And then, according to the accounts that survive, he turned his face away. So did every other priest standing beside him. Nobody watched her actually descend those steps. The one moment that should have mattered most if anyone in that crowd truly believed she might be innocent was the exact moment everyone in charge chose not to witness. I keep coming back to that detail if I am honest with you. An entire college of powerful men capable of ordering this ritual into existence in the first place apparently could not bring themselves to actually watch it happen. There is something almost cowardly buried inside that gesture dressed up as reverence. Averting your eyes does not undo what you're doing. It just means you do not have to carry the memory of watching it. It lets you tell the story afterward, if you ever tell it at all, as something that simply happened rather than something you personally stood there and allowed to happen in front of you. Once she'd gone down, the steps were pulled up behind her. Workers filled the entrance with earth, packing it down, levelling the mound until the ground looked exactly as it had before. No marker, no name, nothing, to indicate that anyone was buried there at all. Whatever happened to her after that point in the dark alone with a lamp that would eventually burn out, and food that would eventually run out, happened without a single witness. Rome made absolutely certain of that. I want to pause here and say something that rarely makes it into the shorter, punchier versions of this story because I think it matters. Under this same religious framework, a Vestal could technically be found guilty even in cases involving assault rather than any choice of her own. The loss of her chastity, however it happened, was treated as the offence itself, not the circumstances surrounding it. I am not going to spend long on that particular detail, because it deserves more weight than a quick aside can really give it, but I refuse to gloss over it either. Whatever else we admire about Roman engineering or law or literature, this particular corner of their religious system could be capable of extraordinary cruelty toward women who'd done nothing wrong at all. A system built entirely around the idea of protecting innocence somehow left almost no room to actually account for it. There is one final irony worth mentioning before we move on, and it is almost too strange to invent. Rome strictly forbade burying anyone inside the city walls, no exceptions for anyone at any time for any reason, except for this. A disgraced Vestal's tomb was the only burial legally permitted within the boundaries of the city itself. The very same purity that had once made her sacrosanct untouchable, protected by the threat of death for anyone who so much as jostled her in the street, was the exact same purity Rome now claimed justified breaking its own oldest burial law just this once, just for her. Think about what that says underneath all the ritual and ceremony. Even in disgrace, even condemned, she remained in Rome's own strange religious logic somehow still sacred enough to require special treatment, special enough to be killed in a way reserved for no one else in the entire empire, special enough to break a rule that applied to literally everyone but her, and that particular exception did not go unnoticed by the ordinary Romans walking past that low earthen ridge near the Colline Gate for centuries afterward. Mothers likely pointed it out to their daughters as they passed. Fathers probably lowered their voices around it the way you might near any place everyone quietly understood but rarely discussed out loud. It became, whether anyone officially intended it to or not, a permanent physical warning, built directly into the landscape of the city, a mound of ordinary-looking earth that every single resident of Rome knew, without needing to be told twice exactly what it actually meant. Now, before this story gets too heavy to carry into the rest of the night, I want to tell you something important. This punishment, as horrifying as it was truly rare across the full stretch of Roman history. A handful of documented cases spread out over more than 1,000 years of the order's existence. Most Vestals spent their entire 30 years, tended their fire, held their privileges, and left quietly into ordinary life without ever coming anywhere near that chamber near the Colline Gate. If you do the rough math on it honestly, a Vestal serving during any given decade had a far better chance of simply growing old inside the temple than she ever did of ending up in that particular field. But statistics rarely comfort anyone living inside genuine fear, do they? Knowing something is unlikely rarely stops a person from feeling its full weight anyway, especially when the alternative is quite literally being sealed underground with a lamp and a loaf of bread. But the threat of it, the fact that it existed at all, shaped every single day of every Vestal service, whether she ever came anywhere near it or not. It sat quietly underneath every glance. A senior Vestal gave a junior one every whispered comment about a dress or a laugh, a touch too loud every single ordinary day that could in theory turn into something far worse, because of nothing more than bad timing or a lightning strike hundreds of miles away. And sometimes, when suspicion did fall on an innocent woman, Rome's own story suggests something almost the opposite of everything we have just talked about. Stories where the goddess herself apparently stepped in and proved a woman's innocence in front of the entire city in ways nobody watching could quite explain away. In front of witnesses who had no obvious reason to lie about what they saw. In front of witnesses who had no obvious reason to lie about what they saw. So let's actually sit inside one of those stories for a while, because after everything we just walked through together, I think we could both use a little proof that this particular tale did not always end the way we just described. Somewhere around the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, a Vestal named Tuccia found herself facing the exact same accusation we have talked about again and again this evening. Unchastity. No confession. No confirmed lover. Just suspicion circling the way it always seemed to circle, looking for somewhere to land. We do not know her accuser's exact complaint, or what set the whole thing in motion in the first place, only that by the time her story reaches us through the historians who preserved it, the machinery of accusation was already fully in motion, exactly as it had been for Postumia, exactly as it would be for Minutia. Here is where her story takes a sharp turn away from everything we've covered so far, though. Rather than simply standing trial and waiting on the judgment of the pontiffs, tradition holds that Tuccia offered to prove her innocence herself in the most public, most impossible way she could think of. She would carry water from the river Tiber all the way to the Temple of Vesta using nothing but a sieve. Think about what that actually means for a second if you have ever held a sieve in your own kitchen. A tool built entirely around the principle of letting liquid through. Asking someone to carry water in one is not a difficult task. It is a physically impossible one unless something well outside the ordinary rules of the world decided to step in and help. According to the Roman writer who recorded her story, Tuccia stood at the riverbank, lowered her sieve into the water, and prayed quietly, asking the goddess Vesta that if her hands had always served her honestly and purely, the water would hold. And then, according to every version of this story that survives, it did exactly that. She walked the entire distance back to the temple sieve held out in front of her, without spilling a single drop in front of a crowd that had gathered specifically to watch her fail. Picture that walk for a second, because I think the sheer length of it is what makes the story land the way it does. This was not a quick trick performed in a single breath over in a second before anyone could really process what they had seen. This was a woman walking slowly, deliberately through public streets, carrying an impossible weight of expectation, the entire way, every single step. Another chance for the whole thing to fall apart in front of everyone who had come to see her humiliated. The tension of that walk, stretched out block by block, strikes me as the real heart of the story, far more than the water itself. Her accuser, whoever he was, simply disappears from the historical record after that moment. No further trial, no recorded punishment for making a false accusation, which honestly tells you something about how these situations tended to work. Once the crowd believed a miracle had happened, the person who started the whole ordeal quietly stopped mattering to anyone keeping the records. Here's something worth noticing if you remember what we talked about earlier regarding a Vestal's actual daily duties. Carrying water was not some invented test plucked out of nowhere. It was already one of her most literal physical responsibilities, drawing pure water from a specific source and carrying it without setting it down along the way. Whoever first told this story about Tuccia was not inventing a random impossible task to prove a point. They were taking the most mundane, unglamorous chore in her entire job description and turning it into the stage for a genuine miracle, the ordinary transformed into the extraordinary, simply by raising the stakes high enough. It is a clever piece of storytelling, whether anyone consciously designed it that way or not, because it takes something the audience already understood intimately, a young priestess doing the same tedious errand she had done 1,000 times before, and lets that familiarity make the impossible version land even harder. I have to admit the skeptic in me has spent a little too much time thinking about how she might have actually pulled this off, assuming there is some grain of real event buried underneath 2,000 years of embellishment. A tightly woven basket treated with enough oil or grease can truly resist water, for a short distance, held together by nothing more than simple surface tension, the same physics that lets certain insects walk across a pond without sinking. I'm not saying that is what happened. I'm saying it is a fascinating thought experiment, and also that ancient audiences almost certainly were not thinking about surface tension when they heard this story. They were thinking about a goddess who apparently still had a soft spot for the wrongly accused. Can I ask you something actually? Do you think stories like this one existed purely to celebrate faith and virtue? Or do you think part of their appeal was something closer to relief, an entire audience quietly needing to believe that innocence could still win, at least sometimes, in a system that so often punished women regardless of what they had actually done? I lean toward the second explanation myself, though I do not think the two possibilities are entirely separate from each other. Maybe faith and relief were always doing the same job, just wearing different names. Trial by impossible task shows up in more places than just Rome, by the way, if you start looking for it. Plenty of ancient cultures built similar tests into their own idea of justice, asking the accused to walk across hot coals or hold a burning object, or perform some other feat. Only innocence or divine favour could survive. There is something almost universal about the instinct behind it. When human testimony fails us, when everyone involved might be lying, exaggerating, or simply wrong, we reach for something outside ourselves to settle the question instead. Rome just happened to give that universal instinct a sieve and a river, I find something quietly moving in that universality, if I'm honest. Cultures separated by oceans, by centuries, by languages that shared no common root whatsoever, kept independently arriving at the exact same conclusion: that when we cannot trust each other to tell the truth, we would rather hand the final decision to fire or water or gravity than admit we simply do not know. It says something a little sad about how much we distrust our own judgment of one another, and something a little hopeful about how badly we still wanted fairness to exist somewhere, even if we had to invent a supernatural referee to guarantee it. Now let me tell you about a second story, one that took place decades after Tuccia's during one of the most truly terrifying stretches of Roman history, and one that comes with a small correction I think is worth making because it gets repeated wrong constantly, even in otherwise serious retellings. Rome was still fighting Hannibal in Italy, the same devastating war that had already led to accusations against 2 Vestals we discussed earlier. Years into a conflict that had already cost Rome tens of thousands of lives and shaken its confidence in almost everything. It once took for granted the city exhausted and frightened, consulted its most sacred prophetic texts, and received an unusual instruction. If Rome wanted to finally turn the war around, it needed to bring a specific sacred stone representing a foreign goddess called the Great Mother, all the way from Asia Minor to Rome itself. Getting that stone across the Mediterranean and up the Tiber was by all accounts its own small saga. But the moment that actually survived in Roman memory happened right at the finish line. The ship carrying that stone eventually reached the mouth of the Tiber, and there it stopped grounded fast in the shallows, refusing to move no matter how hard the sailors strained against it. Experienced crewsmen who had spent their whole lives on the water could not budge a single ship a few final feet toward the city that desperately needed what it carried. Among the crowd of Rome's leading women gathered to receive the goddess stood a woman named Claudia Quinta, whose own reputation, much like Postumia's, had been quietly damaged by gossip about her sharp confidence and her supposedly haughty manner. She'd done nothing anyone could actually point to, only carried herself in a way that made certain people uncomfortable, which by this point in the evening should sound depressingly familiar. Claudia stepped forward in front of sailors, priests, and half the leading families of Rome, prayed aloud for the goddess's help, and tied her own sash to the front of that stuck ship. And then, according to the story, she pulled it free entirely on her own, dragging a vessel that an entire crew of trained sailors could not move in front of the whole watching city. Whatever actually happened on that riverbank physically, mechanically, whether a shifting tide finally did the work, everyone credited to her the story that survived was unambiguous. A woman the city had quietly doubted just did something none of its strongest men could manage. Her story did not simply fade into legend and stay there either. Generations later, the orator Cicero actually invoked Claudia Quinta by name in one of his own court cases, holding her reputation up as the moral opposite of a very different woman he was trying to discredit in front of a Roman jury. A story about a riverbank and a stuck ship, more than a century old by that point, was still considered persuasive enough to sway an active legal argument. That is not a small thing. That is a myth doing actual practical work in the real world centuries after the woman at the centre of it had died. It is without question one of the most dramatic vindication stories in all of Roman tradition, and here is the correction I promised you. Despite how often this story gets told today, with Claudia dressed in Vestal robes, standing in for the whole order the way she does in more than one painting hanging in a museum somewhere right now. The earliest and most numerous ancient sources, Cicero, Livy, Ovid, Pliny among them, never once call her a Vestal at all. They consistently describe her as an ordinary Roman matron, a married woman of high social standing, nothing more. It was only later writers centuries afterward, working with authors like the historian Herodian, who started attaching the title Vestal to her name, and one particularly convincing theory suggests the mix-up happened because a truly famous Vestal, also named Claudia, from that exact same family became well known decades later, and future generations simply merged the two women together in popular memory, blending two separate stories about two separate women into one tidier, more dramatic package. I actually find that mistake more interesting than if the story had been accurate from the start, honestly. It tells you that this particular kind of miracle, a wrongly suspected woman publicly humiliated over nothing more than her manner or her confidence saved by sudden, undeniable divine intervention, was such a satisfying story that Rome kept reaching for it, attaching it to women who were not even Vestals, simply because the shape of the story mattered more to people than the specific details of who was actually living it. It is a little like the way certain modern stories get retold and reshaped, over decades gaining details nobody actually witnessed, until the emotional truth of the tale matters more to everyone repeating it than whatever actually happened on one specific afternoon by a river, which tells you something important about everything we've covered tonight, I think. This was never really only about 6 women guarding one particular fire. It was about an entire society that had built female virtue into something so publicly monitored, so constantly on trial, that even women who had nothing to do with that round temple in the Forum still found themselves standing in front of a crowd, having to prove spectacularly that they deserved to be believed. Claudia Quinta never took a vow, never gave up her name, her family, or her freedom to marry, and she still ended up standing at a riverbank, performing an impossible feat in front of strangers simply to answer for the crime of being talked about. Maybe that is worth turning over in your mind for a second. How many women across how many centuries have found themselves doing some version of the exact same thing, proving something extraordinary in public, not because anyone actually caught them doing anything wrong, but simply because enough people had already decided quietly among themselves that they probably had. Maybe that is the real reason these two stories survived so vividly, if you ask me, while so many others quietly disappeared. Not because miracles were common. We already know from everything we covered earlier tonight exactly how rare a happy ending actually was inside that system. But because everyone listening then and now wanted at least a few stories where the water held, where the ship finally moved, where the crowd that gathered to watch a woman fail went home having watched her prove them all wrong instead. Not every accused woman in Roman history got a sieve that held or a ship that finally gave way. Some got exactly the opposite, a verdict that could not be undone by any prayer, any miracle, any last-minute intervention from a watching goddess. And one of those stories belongs to a woman who did not die in some distant corner of the Republic, forgotten by history, the way so many others were, but in the full glare of an emperor's own personal fury, decades into the age of the Caesars, in a case so brutal and so blatantly political that even other Romans at the time quietly questioned whether justice had anything to do with it at all. Her name was remembered, carved into records that survived precisely because of who eventually turned against her, and precisely because, for the very first time in this entire story, the fire she had guarded for most of her life would not be enough to save her from the man who wanted her gone. The fire she'd guarded for most of her life would not be enough to save her from the man who wanted her gone. Her name was Cornelia, and by the time this story catches up with her, she was not some anxious young novice still learning the ritual formulas. She was the Virgo Maxima, the chief Vestal, the most senior priestess in the entire order, standing only 2 years away from finishing a full 30-year term of service. Let that sink in for a second before we go any further. 2 years. After everything we have walked through together tonight, the captio, the decade of training, the water jars, the fire, watches, the privileges, and the constant quiet threat hanging over every single one of them, Cornelia had nearly made it all the way through. She was near enough to the end that she could likely see it coming, near enough that whatever plans she had for her own retirement were probably already taking shape in her mind. The man who decided her fate instead was the Emperor Domitian, and if you know anything at all about Roman history, that name alone probably just made you sit up a little straighter. Domitian ruled Rome from the year 81 to the year 96 of the Common Era, and by most contemporary accounts he ruled it the way a deeply paranoid, deeply insecure man rules anything he is terrified of losing. Suspicious of the Senate, suspicious of his own family, obsessed, according to multiple ancient historians, with looking severe, disciplined, and morally upright in the eyes of Rome, even when his own private behaviour told a rather different story. He surrounded himself later in his reign, especially with informers and spies, men whose entire livelihood depended on finding anyone to accuse of disloyalty or moral failing. It was by most surviving accounts an exhausting paranoid atmosphere to exist inside an entire capital city, learning to watch what it said, who it associated with, and how it appeared in public, because Domitian's idea of strength apparently required a steady supply of visible enemies to crush. Here is a detail worth sitting with before we get to Cornelia specifically, because it tells you everything about the pattern we're about to walk through. Before Domitian came to power, Rome had gone almost 2 centuries without executing a single Vestal for unchastity. Nearly 200 years of relative peace inside that particular fear we spent so much time on earlier tonight. And then Domitian took the throne, and within just a few years of his reign he had already put multiple Vestals to death years before Cornelia's case even began. A pair of sisters from a family named Oculata, along with at least one other priestess, were executed early in his rule, well over a decade before Cornelia herself came under suspicion. A practice that had gone quiet for generations suddenly violently revived by one specific ruler, with one specific reason for wanting Rome to notice how strict he could be. That reason, if you ask most historians who have studied this particular emperor closely, had very little to do with actual religious devotion. Domitian wanted Rome to see him as a moral reformer, a strict guardian of old-fashioned Roman virtue, at a moment when his own legitimacy as emperor was shakier than he wanted anyone to admit. Punishing Vestals publicly dramatically was cheap, effective political theatre. It let him perform severity without actually having to fix anything difficult about how he governed. And there is something particularly telling in the fact that, according to Suetonius, Domitian did not even apply the punishment consistently across his own reign. The earlier Vestals he executed were allowed unusually to choose their own manner of death, a departure from tradition he seemed almost proud of. By the time Cornelia's case came around, he swung back to the old method entirely, the full ceremonial weight of burying her alive, as though tradition itself was simply another tool he could pick up or set aside depending on which version made the strongest impression that particular year. So when suspicion eventually turned toward Cornelia herself, years into this pattern, Rome already knew on some level exactly what kind of emperor was about to decide her fate. This was not an isolated tragedy landing on one unlucky woman out of nowhere. It was the continuation of something Domitian had already proven he was willing to do more than once, whenever his own political needs called for a dramatic display of severity. Now here is where this particular case becomes truly different from everything else we've discussed tonight, and honestly, where it becomes almost impossible to defend as anything resembling justice, even by Rome's own already imperfect standards. When the time came to try Cornelia formally, Domitian did not convene the usual proceeding with the usual college of priests in the usual place. He summoned the pontiffs not to the customary location in the city, but out to his own private villa outside Rome on his own terms, surrounded by his own people. And Cornelia herself was not there. She was not present to speak in her own defence, to answer questions, to challenge whatever evidence, if any, had actually been presented against her. Rome's most senior priestess was formally condemned to death in a room she was never even permitted to enter. Think back for a moment to everything we covered earlier about Postumia and Minutia, and the trials that followed the defeat at Cannae. Whatever their flaws, whatever their reliance on gossip and testimony, rather than genuine evidence, those proceedings at least followed a recognizable structure. The accused present the pontiffs gathered in their customary role, some functioning shadow of due process. Domitian discarded even that thin shred of formality. He did not need Cornelia in the room because the verdict was never actually in doubt. The trial itself was decoration, a formality performed for an audience that was never really the point. The point was the punishment, and everything leading up to it existed purely to make that punishment look from a distance like justice, rather than what it actually was. We know all of this in such striking specific detail because a Roman writer named Pliny the Younger happened to be alive at the time, moving in the same social circles as many of the people involved, and he wrote about it afterward in a private letter to a friend named Cornelius Minicianus. That letter survives tucked among a much larger collection of his personal correspondence, and it is worth remembering what that actually means. Pliny was not some anonymous chronicler writing generations later, piecing events together from fragments and rumour. He was a practicing lawyer, a former public official, a man who had personally argued cases in Roman courts and understood better than almost anyone else, who left writing behind exactly what a fair trial was supposed to look like. And in that letter, Pliny does not sound like a man simply recording history at a comfortable distance. He sounds angry. He describes Domitian as being consumed by rage specifically because his own witnesses had, in Pliny's words, left him in the lurch, meaning the evidence Domitian expected to use against Cornelia had apparently fallen apart. And instead of accepting that, instead of letting an accusation collapse, the way the law technically required, Domitian pushed forward anyway, determined, as Pliny put it, to make his reign memorable through exactly this kind of severity. Pliny goes further too, describing Domitian's conduct that day, not as the careful judgment of a religious authority, but as something closer to the raw, unchecked cruelty of a tyrant indulging whatever impulse crossed his mind. Sit with that phrase for a second, because I think it is the whole story in miniature. Not justice, not religious duty. A tyrant deliberately choosing to kill a woman he could not actually prove had done anything wrong, because the killing itself was the point, a message written in the clearest language Domitian knew how to speak. Here's a question worth asking yourself honestly. How many systems throughout history, not just Rome's, have used the appearance of ritual procedure and tradition to disguise something that was never really about justice at all, but about power, needing somewhere public to display itself? Once the verdict, if we can even call it that, had been decided, Cornelia was led through the same kind of procession we described earlier tonight toward the same field, near the column gate, dressed the same way, watched by the same kind of silent, uneasy crowd. And according to Pliny, she did not go quietly or passively in the way you might expect from someone utterly broken by the process. She spoke out publicly on her way to that chamber, asking essentially how Domitian could possibly believe her impure when she was the very priestess whose rites had accompanied his own military victories, whose service to Vesta had stood behind his own triumphs as emperor. Think about the sheer nerve that must have taken. This was a woman walking toward her own death at the direct order of a man notorious for having anyone who defied him quietly removed, and she chose in that final public moment not silence, not pleading, but a direct pointed challenge to the very legitimacy of his rule. If the gods had truly turned against Rome because of her supposed impurity, she seemed to be asking then how exactly had Domitian's own armies kept winning under rites she herself had performed. It was by any measure an extraordinarily bold thing to say to a man who held absolute power over her final moments, and it survived specifically because the people who heard it never forgot it, repeating it afterward until it eventually reached a lawyer with a pen and a friend worth writing to. There is one more detail from that day, I think, about more than almost anything else in this entire story. As Cornelia descended the steps into the underground chamber, her robe caught on something, and she stumbled slightly. The soldier or attendant standing nearby instinctively reached out a hand to steady her, the way anyone might without thinking when they see a person about to fall. Cornelia pulled away from that hand. She caught her own balance on her own and continued down those steps without letting a man's touch assist her, even in the final seconds of her life. Even walking toward a death she insisted right up to the end she did not deserve. I do not think that gesture was really about balance at all, if I am honest with you. I think it was the only form of protest she had left. Rome had already decided her guilt without ever letting her speak in her own defense. It had already stripped her of every privilege, every ounce of authority she had spent nearly 30 years earning. But it could not force her to accept a man's hand on her way into that chamber, and so she made absolutely certain it never got the chance. It is a small gesture in the grand scheme of a story this large, but small gestures are sometimes all a person has left to work with, and I think what you do with the very last choice available to you says more about who you actually are than almost anything that came before it. Have you ever noticed that, by the way, in your own life or in stories you've heard from people you trust, how often the truest measure of someone's character shows up, not in the big dramatic decisions everyone gets to plan for in advance, but in some tiny, almost unremarkable moment when there is truly nothing left to gain from behaving well, and they do it anyway. Her accused lovers did not fare any better, by the way, and Rome, true to the pattern we already discussed, did not extend the same elaborate drawn-out ritual to them. They were beaten to death publicly in the Forum, a swift, brutal punishment that lasted minutes rather than days, the same asymmetry between how Rome treated a woman's alleged crime and a man's alleged participation in it that we talked about earlier tonight. Now, I want to say something directly to you here because I think this particular story deserves it. Domitian did not survive very much longer after all of this. Just a handful of years later, in the year 96, his own household turned against him. He was assassinated in his own palace, stabbed to death in a conspiracy involving people from his own inner circle, including, according to some accounts, members of his own staff and family who had simply had enough. The Senate, freed from his rule, at last formally condemned his memory afterward, striking his name from public monuments, wherever they could find it, chiseling it off arches and inscriptions across the entire city, a punishment the Romans reserved for rulers they wanted history to actively forget rather than simply remember badly. There is something almost fitting in a grim sort of way about a man so obsessed with controlling how Rome remembered him, ending up with his own name physically erased from the very monuments he had built to secure that memory. He spent years deciding which women deserved to have their names wiped from history for supposed crimes against Rome's purity. In the end, Rome decided the same thing about him for reasons that had nothing to do with purity at all. I'm not going to pretend that counts as justice for Cornelia. It does not undo what happened to her, and I do not think we should treat it as some tidy, satisfying moral ribbon tied around a truly horrifying story. But I will say this much. The same empire that let one furious, insecure man kill a woman on evidence too weak to survive its own courtroom did not in the end let that same man keep his throne, his reputation, or even his name for very much longer either. Make of that whatever you want to make of it. I know I have my own opinion, and I suspect after everything we've walked through together tonight you might already share it. Cornelia never got to find out what waited for her on the other side of those 30 years, 2 of them still stretched out ahead of her, when Domitian decided she would never see them. Which makes me wonder about the women who did make it all the way through, the ones who tended that flame for 3 full decades, and actually walked out the other side into a version of freedom almost nobody else in Rome could fully imagine. What was actually waiting for them out there after a lifetime spent inside those particular walls? What was actually waiting for them out there after a lifetime spent inside those particular walls? Let's actually find out, because I think the answer surprised me more than almost anything else I came across while putting this story together. Once a Vestal finally reached the end of her 30 years somewhere in her mid to late 30s, sometimes closer to 40, Rome did not simply send her off with a polite thank you and an empty hearth behind her. She retired with a truly substantial pension guaranteed for the rest of her life, on top of whatever personal wealth she'd already accumulated through 30 years of gifts, bequests, and shrewd property management under that same sui juris independence we talked about earlier tonight. By any honest measure, a retired Vestal left that temple as one of the wealthiest, most financially secure women in the entire Roman world. Try to picture the actual scale of that for a second, because I think it is easy to hear the word pension and imagine something modest, a small stipend to get by on. This was closer to walking out of a decades-long career with both a guaranteed income and a fortune already banked at an age young enough to still truly enjoy it. Roman life expectancy for anyone lucky enough to survive childhood could stretch comfortably into someone's 60s, 70s, occasionally further. A woman retiring in her late 30s, wealthy and completely her own master, potentially had 30 or 40 more years ahead of her to spend however she pleased, a kind of retirement almost nobody else in the ancient world, male or female, could realistically expect. And here is the detail that truly stopped me in my tracks the first time I came across it. She was also legally free to marry. The Pontifex Maximus himself would, at least in theory, step into something resembling the role of a father arranging the match, helping select a suitably respectable husband for a woman Rome considered one of its most honoured citizens. Except as far as we can tell from everything that survives, almost none of them actually did it. Think about that for a second, because it is a truly strange historical silence. We have detailed records of Vestal trials, Vestal privileges, Vestal punishments, entire inscriptions honouring individual women by name carved into stone and preserved for us to study 2,000 years later. And yet across roughly 11 centuries of this institution, existing historians have not been able to point to a single, clearly documented marriage of a former Vestal after her retirement. Not one confirmed wedding in over 1,000 years, despite it being completely legal, socially encouraged, and according to some Roman writers considered truly lucky for the husband involved. That is not a small gap in the record either. Rome was a society obsessed with documenting marriages, especially among its elite families, precisely because marriage alliances mattered enormously to political and financial power. If even a handful of retired Vestals had married into prominent families, you would expect at least some trace of it to survive somewhere in a letter, an inscription, a passing mention in a historian's account of some notable household. The near-total silence on the subject is its own kind of evidence. So what actually happened instead? The Roman writer Plutarch, writing generations later, offers an explanation that I find both fascinating and a little sad depending on how you choose to look at it. He claims that the small number of Vestals who did marry tended to end up unhappy, regretful, even said to be haunted by something resembling misfortune for the rest of their lives. Whether that was genuine coincidence, cruel bad luck, or simply the kind of story people tell each other to explain a pattern they do not fully understand. Plutarch says this reputation spread widely enough that it actively discouraged other Vestals from ever attempting it. Rather than risk that particular curse, most simply renewed their commitment to chastity anyway, informally if not through any fresh official vow, and lived out the remainder of their lives exactly as they had spent the previous 30 years. I think there is a more practical explanation sitting right alongside Plutarch's superstition, and it has nothing to do with curses at all. A woman retiring from the order in her mid to late 30s was already by elite Roman standards considered unusually old to be entering marriage for the very first time in a society where noble girls were frequently engaged in their early teens. The realistic pool of appropriate willing husbands was probably a great deal smaller than the flattering idea of being universally sought after would suggest. And beyond that, why would a woman who had spent 30 years managing her own property, speaking in courtrooms as an unquestioned witness, and answering to no man at all, suddenly choose to place herself under a husband's legal authority, the exact structure every other Roman woman was trapped inside from birth? I will admit there is something almost comedic about imagining that particular first date, if we can even call it that. A wealthy, famous, fiercely independent woman in her late 30s being introduced by the Pontifex Maximus himself to some hopeful Roman bachelor who presumably had to sit there and somehow make the case that trading her entire hard-won independence for marriage to him specifically was a truly good idea. I would not have taken that bet either, honestly. Here's something worth asking yourself honestly. If you had spent 30 years building complete financial independence, real social standing, and the freedom to make every major decision about your own life without asking anyone's permission, how eager would you actually be to trade all of that away, even for something as socially celebrated as marriage? I suspect a lot of us sitting comfortably in a modern world that still has not fully solved this exact tension would recognize more of ourselves in that hesitation than we might expect. So most former Vestals, it seems, simply stayed near what they already knew. Many likely continued living in or near the Atrium Vestae itself, remaining part of that same small community even after officially stepping back from active duty. Picture what that must have looked like in practice. A woman in her late 30s or early 40s, wealthy, independent, deeply respected across the entire city, still walking those familiar courtyards, still recognized everywhere she went, but for the first time in 3 decades, answerable to absolutely nobody about how she spent her days. She could travel if the idea of finally seeing places beyond Rome appealed to her, something almost entirely unavailable to a serving Vestal whose duties tied her to that one temple for 30 consecutive years. She could buy property somewhere quiet outside the city if she wanted distance from it all, a villa in the countryside away from the noise and scrutiny of a capital that had watched her every public move since she was 6 years old. She could, if she chose, act as something like an honoured elder statesperson within Roman religious life, consulted, respected, invited to advise the younger Vestals still working through their own 30 years, never quite ordinary again, but no longer confined by the same rigid schedule either. Some may have taken in nieces or grandnieces, played the role of a beloved, slightly mysterious aunt at family gatherings she had missed for decades. Others, I imagine, simply enjoyed the strange, quiet luxury of waking up on an ordinary morning with absolutely nothing specific she was required to do. It is one of the more unexpectedly hopeful notes in this entire story, if you ask me. After everything we have covered tonight, the captio, the constant threat of suspicion, Cornelia's fate under Domitian, it is worth remembering that the vast majority of Vestals across that entire 11th century history simply lived, served their term and walked away into a version of freedom almost no other Roman woman ever got to experience at all. Now I want to widen the lens for a moment, because Rome was not the only ancient civilization that decided the safest place to put extraordinary religious authority was inside the body of a carefully controlled woman. And the differences between Rome's approach and everyone else's tell you almost as much as the similarities do. Consider the Pythia, the priestess who spoke for the god Apollo at the Oracle of Delphi, arguably the single most influential religious voice in the entire Greek-speaking world for well over 1,000 years. Kings' generals, entire city-states all travelled to consult her before making decisions that could shape the fate of a war or a colony. Some historians have gone as far as describing her as sitting at the centre of something resembling an information network, quietly gathering and weighing news from travellers across the Mediterranean before delivering her answers, which honestly makes her sound less like a mystic in a trance, and more like one of the best informed political consultants of the entire ancient world. And yet the woman chosen to fill that role looked almost nothing like a Vestal. She was not selected from Greece's wealthiest, most politically connected families. Quite the opposite, according to several ancient sources. The Pythia was often deliberately chosen from ordinary, even modest backgrounds, specifically because a woman with no real political education, no personal stake in the rivalries between cities, was considered less likely to let her own opinions quietly shape the god's supposed message. Plutarch himself apparently described these women as having been raised in the homes of poor farmers about as far removed from Rome's patrician selection criteria as you could possibly get. Where Rome wanted a girl from an unimpeachable noble bloodline, Delphi seemed to actively prefer someone with no bloodline worth mentioning at all, and her age at selection shifted dramatically over time too. Early tradition describes a young unmarried woman filling the role not unlike the youthful image most people still picture today. But after one particularly disturbing incident, a visiting client apparently assaulting a young Pythia while she was alone in the sanctuary, Delphi changed the requirement entirely and began selecting women over the age of 50. Instead, often widows or mothers whose children were already grown, stepping into a role that asked them to set aside ordinary family life, but only after most of it had already happened. Sit with that difference for a second, because I think it says something quietly damning about Rome's own choice by comparison. Delphi, after watching what youth and isolation could expose a woman to, adjusted its entire selection process to protect against exactly that danger. Rome, for its part, kept placing 6-year-old girls in that same position for the next several hundred years, seemingly without ever seriously reconsidering whether there was a safer way to do it. I find that contrast almost impossible to look past honestly once you notice it. Two of the ancient world's most respected religious institutions built around remarkably similar ideas, a woman's isolation from ordinary life somehow guaranteeing access to divine truth or divine protection, and yet one of them eventually learned from its own worst mistake, while the other simply kept repeating its version of the same risk, generation after generation, for the better part of 1,000 years. Why do you think that pattern shows up so consistently across so many unrelated civilizations? By the way, Rome, Greece, and plenty of cultures well beyond either of them, all independently arriving at some version of the same idea that removing a woman from ordinary life, family, marriage, personal ambition somehow made her a safer vessel for sacred power than a woman living an ordinary one. I do not think that is a coincidence. I think it says something uncomfortable about how consistently ancient societies handled female authority, granting it generously, but almost always on the condition that the woman holding it first give up nearly everything else that made her an ordinary person. It is worth noticing too what these societies never seem to ask of their male priests in quite the same way. Roman priests in other colleges, augurs, flamines, the various men who held their own sacred offices, generally kept their households, their marriages, their children right alongside their religious duties. Nobody suggested a man's political ambition or family life made him too unreliable a channel for the gods. That particular suspicion apparently was reserved almost exclusively for women, as though only female judgment needed to be stripped of every ordinary human attachment before anyone would trust it completely. I wonder if you have noticed a quieter version of that same double standard somewhere in your own life. Honestly, some version of the idea that a woman's competence or trustworthiness gets treated as conditional on what she's given up, while a man's rarely does. It is not a new observation, I know, but it is strange and a little humbling to watch it playing out this clearly, 2,000 years before anyone had a modern word for it. Both of these institutions, as it happens, met their end within just a few years of each other, swept away by the exact same wave of religious change sweeping across the late Roman world. The oracle at Delphi fell silent around the year 390, its final prophecies fading out as a new religion took hold across the empire that had once travelled to consult it. Vesta's flame followed only a handful of years later, extinguished by decree rather than by silence by a specific emperor's specific deliberate choice. That particular ending, at least on Rome's side of the story, deserves its own telling slowly properly, because it is truly one of the strangest and most quietly devastating chapters in this entire 1100-year history. It is not a story about suspicion or trial, or any individual Vestal's fate. It is the story of how an institution that had outlasted kings, wars, invasions, and the collapse of the Republic itself finally met something it could not simply rebuild its way through, and it starts with an emperor who had already decided long before he ever touched that flame that the old gods no longer had any place in his empire at all. An emperor who had already decided long before he ever touched that flame that the old gods no longer had any place in his empire at all. His name was Gratian, and the story of how this entire 1100-year-old institution actually came to an end starts quietly enough, not with a war or a scandal or a single dramatic verdict, but with a decision about money, the kind of unglamorous administrative choice that rarely makes it into the more dramatic retellings of Roman history, and yet ended up mattering more than almost any battle we could have told you about instead. In the year 382, Gratian withdrew the state funding that had supported the Vestals and the rest of Rome's traditional priesthoods for longer than anyone alive could remember. He had the altar of victory, an ancient monument that had stood in the Senate house for centuries, physically removed. And in a move that stunned even his own court, he refused to accept the title every emperor before him had worn since the days of Julius Caesar Pontifex Maximus, the very office that had once sent a man to Amata's own Captio, the office that had condemned Cornelia to that chamber near the Colline Gate. Gratian simply would not carry it. A Christian emperor, he apparently decided, had no business holding the highest priestly title of a religion he no longer believed in. Think about the sheer symbolic weight packed into that one refusal. For well over 300 years, every single emperor, no matter how personally devout or indifferent, had automatically taken on that title, becoming, at least on paper, the highest religious authority in the entire Roman world. Gratian looked at that unbroken chain and simply declined to be the next link in it. It was not a loud announcement. There was no dramatic public ceremony marking the moment. It was closer to a quiet administrative note, and yet it effectively told every priest, every augur, and every vestal still serving in Rome exactly where they now stood in his empire's actual priorities. Picture what that decision actually meant for the 6 women still living and serving inside the Atrium Vestae at that exact moment. Their salaries gone, their temple's maintenance budget gone, an entire financial structure that had quietly supported this institution since the days of kings dismantled by a single administrative decision made by a ruler who likely never gave much thought to what it would practically mean for the specific women left holding a flame nobody in power was willing to pay for anymore. Rome's pagan aristocracy did not simply accept this quietly, though, and this is where the story takes an unexpectedly dramatic turn, one that has nothing to do with fire or accusation, and everything to do with 2 of the most brilliant minds of their entire generation going head-to-head over exactly what kind of empire Rome was still allowed to be. After Gratian's death, a Roman senator named Symmachus, widely considered one of the finest orators of his era, someone people frequently compared to Cicero, made a formal appeal to the new emperor, a young man named Valentinian II, asking him to restore both the altar of victory and the funding that had once supported Rome's ancient priesthoods, the Vestals specifically included by name. Symmachus's argument was not really about any single god or any single ritual. It was about identity continuity, the idea that Rome's entire historical success was bound up with the traditions it had always practiced, and that abandoning them now this abruptly risked severing the empire from whatever had made it great in the first place. He famously argued that different peoples might reasonably approach the same divine mystery through different paths, an appeal essentially for tolerance for letting the old ways simply continue existing, alongside the new one. Standing directly against him was a bishop from Milan named Ambrose, a man with far less formal political power than a Roman senator, but with something arguably more valuable at that particular moment: direct personal influence over a young, impressionable emperor. Ambrose wrote back forcefully in a pair of letters that survive to this day, essentially arguing that a Christian ruler could not in good conscience lend his authority to what Ambrose openly called superstition, regardless of how old or how eloquently defended that superstition happened to be. He went further too, suggesting that the very idea of restoring the old rites amounted to asking Christ himself to share an altar with idols, framing the entire dispute not as a matter of civic tradition, but as a direct test of the emperor's own soul. It is worth pausing on how lopsided that particular contest actually was once you look closely at it. Symmachus held one of the most prestigious civic offices in Rome, a reputation for eloquence people, compared favourably to the greatest orators of the Republic, and centuries of tradition standing behind him. Ambrose held a bishopric in a city that was not even Rome, and comparatively little formal political authority of his own. And yet Ambrose won decisively, because the actual currency that mattered by the late 4th century was no longer classical eloquence or ancestral prestige. It was proximity to a Christian emperor's private conscience, and nobody in the empire understood how to work that particular lever better than Ambrose did. Here's a question worth sitting with before I tell you who won. Whose argument do you find more persuasive even now, 2,000 years removed from either man's stake in the outcome? Continuity for its own sake, the idea that old things deserve protection simply because they are old and have always been there. Or the idea that a society is allowed, even obligated, to outgrow traditions it no longer actually believes in whatever the cost to the people still living inside them. I do not think there is a clean, comfortable answer here, and I suspect that is exactly why this particular debate still gets studied and argued about more than 16 centuries later. Ambrose won, not through better logic necessarily, but through better access. His relationship with the imperial court simply outweighed anything Symmachus could offer, however beautifully phrased. The funding stayed cut, the altar of victory stayed removed, and for the 6 women still tending that flame in the forum, the empire had just delivered its answer quietly, through a bureaucratic dispute most ordinary Romans probably never even fully understood was happening. A few years later, the situation moved from financial to absolute. In the early 390s, the Emperor Theodosius I issued a series of edicts banning public pagan worship across the entire empire outright. Sacrifices forbidden. Temple visits by officials forbidden. Whatever remained of Rome's old civic religion, the same religion that had once demanded a 6-year-old girl's entire childhood in exchange for the city's safety, was no longer simply underfunded. It was illegal. We actually know the name of the very last confirmed chief Vestal, by the way, which is a detail I find quietly remarkable, given everything else we have covered tonight about names lost to history, about girls' history rarely bothered to record at all. A woman named Caelia Concordia is recorded through a surviving inscription dated to the year 385, honouring a recently deceased Roman priest. She was still serving, still functioning as Virgo Maxima right in the middle of this entire collapse, watching the funding disappear, watching the legal ground shift beneath an institution she had likely spent decades of her own life inside. Try to imagine what her actual daily experience must have looked like during those years, still rising for the same duties, still presumably tending whatever remained of that flame even as the money to properly maintain the temple around it quietly dried up, still holding a title that the empire's own laws were actively working to make meaningless. There is something almost unbearably poignant about continuing to do a sacred job faithfully, precisely exactly as it has always been done, while the world outside slowly, deliberately strips away every reason anyone in power still has to care. According to later tradition, she eventually converted to Christianity herself before her death, sometime in the earliest years of the following century, outliving the very order she had once led. I think about that conversion more than almost anything else in this whole story, honestly. A woman who had spent the bulk of her life devoted formally and completely to Vesta, choosing near the very end to follow the religion that had just legislated her entire life's work out of existence. Was that genuine faith quietly discovered late in life? Practical necessity in a Rome where the old gods no longer offered any protection at all? Something in between the two, the way most real human decisions actually are, we do not know, and I do not think we ever will. But it feels like an oddly fitting final image for this entire 1100-year story, an ending that refuses to be simple right up to its very last surviving name. Sometime around the year 394, the sacred fire itself, the exact flame we open this entire journey, with the one Amata was told on her very first afternoon in that temple, could never be allowed to go dark, went dark. Formally, permanently by imperial decree rather than accident or negligence. No dramatic final ceremony survives in the record. No grand farewell, no crowd gathered in mourning the way one might gather for the death of an emperor. As far as historians can tell, it simply stopped the way a candle stops when nobody bothers relighting it anymore, closing out well over 1,000 years of continuous unbroken tending. Generations of 6-year-old girls, water jars, midnight watches, and desperate prayers over a sieve, all of it quietly folding into silence on one unrecorded afternoon, nobody thought to mark for remembering. I find that ending almost harder to sit with than any single execution we covered earlier tonight, honestly. A death, however brutal, at least gets a witness, a date and name attached to it somewhere in the record. This was different. An entire sprawling institution, one that had shaped Roman religious life for longer than most modern nations have existed at all, simply ran out of oxygen administratively, and nobody apparently felt the moment was significant enough to write down exactly when it happened. There is one more story worth telling here, though. I want to be honest with you about how solid the ground underneath it actually is. A later historian named Zosimus, writing decades after these events, and generally sympathetic to the old pagan cause, recorded a strange, almost ghostly tale. According to Zosimus, a Christian noblewoman connected to the imperial family entered the old sanctuary of the Magna Mater, the very same temple whose statue we talked about earlier tonight, the one connected to Claudia Quinta and that grounded ship on the Tiber, and removed a sacred necklace from a statue inside it. As she put the necklace on herself, an elderly woman apparently stepped forward out of the shadows to rebuke her for the act identified in the story as the very last living Vestal, still quietly performing some version of her duties in a temple the rest of the world had already abandoned. It is a truly haunting image if you let yourself sit with it. One final elderly priestess alone in an empty sanctuary nobody funds anymore, nobody legally recognizes anymore, still showing up, still guarding something because it is simply who she has always been. Modern historians are honestly skeptical of the story's details, and there is real doubt about whether the specific visit it describes could have even happened the way Zosimus claims. I'm not going to pretend it is verified fact, but true or not, I think it survived for a reason. Rome needed one final image of devotion, outlasting relevance faith, persisting quietly in a world that had already legally moved on without it, and that image is exactly what this particular legend gives us. So here is where I want to leave you for a moment, all the way back at the beginning of everything we have covered. A 6-year-old girl standing in a crowded square watching her mother's braid disappear into a stranger's fist, having absolutely no idea that she was stepping into a story that would run for over 1,000 years, through kings and emperors and tyrants and miracles, and one furious man's private villa, all the way to a single quiet moment when a fire that was never supposed to go dark finally permanently did. I keep coming back to a question I asked you near the very start of tonight's journey, and I think it is worth asking one final time now that you actually know the whole story. Could you have lasted a single day as her? Not just the fear or the danger, though. We have certainly covered plenty of both tonight. The weight of it. 30 years, or in a martyr's case, a lifetime spent being simultaneously more powerful and less free than almost any other woman in the ancient world, carrying an entire city's safety on your shoulders before you'd even lost all your baby teeth. Maybe the honest answer is that most of us could not have, and maybe that is exactly the point of telling a story like this one at all. Not to prove that we are somehow weaker than a 6-year-old girl from 2,000 years ago, but to notice clearly just how much an ordinary person can be asked to carry when an entire society decides collectively that someone has to. But here is the strange part, the part that truly surprised me while I was researching all of this. Rome extinguished that flame in the year 394, believing presumably that it was closing the book on this story for good. It was not entirely correct about that. Pieces of a martyr's world, pieces of Vesta, pieces of this exact institution somehow slipped past that final imperial decree and kept travelling forward through history anyway, showing up in places you would probably never expect to find them, all the way into the language you and I are using to talk about this right now tonight. Pieces of a martyr's world, pieces of Vesta, pieces of this exact institution somehow slipped past that final imperial decree and kept travelling forward through history anyway, showing up in places you would probably never expect to find them, all the way into the language you and I are using to talk about this right now tonight. So let's actually chase that thread all the way to the end, because I think it might be my favourite part of this entire journey. the part where a story that technically ended in the year 394 turns out to have never really finished at all. The word itself survived. Vestal. It slipped quietly into English somewhere in the 1400s, borrowed directly from that same Latin word Rome had used for centuries, and it never really left. Open a modern dictionary today, any of the major ones, and you will still find it sitting there defined as chaste, pure, virtuous. Sometimes used as a noun on its own, sometimes as an adjective describing anything from a person's demeanour to the cut of a dress. Writers still reach for it right now in this exact decade when they want to describe something guarded, protected, kept deliberately untouched. A recent newspaper piece I came across compared corporate sponsorship rules to something guarded like Vestal Virginity. Another described a particular fashion trend as having a Vestal look. A magazine article discussing a completely unrelated fashion show described certain garments as Vestal robes, reimagined for an entirely different century. None of those writers needed to explain what the word meant. They simply trusted that whoever was reading already carried enough of this story somewhere in the back of their mind to understand exactly what image they were reaching for. 2,000 years after a martyr's last afternoon in that temple, her title is still doing quiet, useful work in a language she never spoke a single word of, still carrying the same essential meaning it carried the very first time a Roman parent whispered it to a frightened 6-year-old girl in the Forum. Even the word nun in some of its oldest recorded English usage apparently carried a secondary meaning tied directly back to Vestal, as though English speakers centuries ago already sensed some quiet kinship between the two ideas long before anyone wrote a scholarly paper connecting them formally. There is a small town in upstate New York called Vestal too, which I will admit made me laugh a little when I first stumbled across it, during all of this research imagining some 17th or 18th century town planner, thousands of miles and a full ocean away from the Roman Forum reaching for that exact word to name a patch of land near a river. History has a strange sense of humour, sometimes carrying a word that far only to have it end up on a highway sign. Here's a slightly heavier thread worth pulling, though one I think matters more than the dictionary entries. Centuries after Vesta's flame went dark for the last time, an entirely different religious tradition, developing independently, arrived at something structurally familiar. Christian convents, communities of women bound by vows of chastity, living communally devoted to religious service, answering to their own internal hierarchy, rather than to husbands or fathers. Nobody designed that as a deliberate echo of Rome's old priesthood. The theology behind it came from somewhere else, entirely rooted in an entirely different set of scriptures and traditions, with no direct line back to Vesta at all. And yet the basic shape women choosing, or in earlier centuries sometimes being placed into a life defined by vowed chastity and communal purpose in exchange for a kind of authority and respect. The outside world rarely extended to women, otherwise kept reappearing across cultures and centuries that had no direct connection to each other at all. A woman who took vows could in certain later medieval convents become an abbess, overseeing significant property, negotiating with bishops and even kings, running what amounted to a small self-governed institution in exactly the kind of role secular marriage would have almost certainly closed off to her entirely. Is that a coincidence? Honestly, I go back and forth on it. Maybe it says something about how many different societies working independently landed on roughly the same uncomfortable bargain when they tried to figure out where women were allowed to hold real institutional power. Or maybe it just says something about how deeply human beings across every culture we have ever studied keep associating restraint with trustworthiness, purity with authority, whether that association is actually fair or not. If you ever find yourself walking through the Roman Forum in person, by the way, you can still stand exactly where so much of tonight's story actually happened. The round foundation of Vesta's temple is still there, roofless, now open to the sky in a way that feels almost deliberate considering everything we know about how that story ended. A handful of white marble columns still stand at odd angles, reconstructed by archaeologists working from fragments enough to suggest the shape of the building without ever fully completing it, as though the ruins themselves refuse to pretend the story has a tidy finished ending. Right beside it, the house of the Vestals still stands too, that same courtyard, that same long reflecting pool we talked about earlier tonight, still visible, still walkable nearly 2,000 years later. Tourists sit on the low stone walls surrounding it to rest their feet between other stops on the Forum tour, probably without any idea that they are resting in the exact spot where 6 women once lived out entire lifetimes, bound by rules most modern visitors would find almost impossible to imagine following for even a single week. And if you look closely enough at the statue bases lining that courtyard, you can still see it, the detail we mentioned toward the beginning of this journey. Certain names deliberately scratched away centuries ago by someone who wanted a particular woman erased from memory entirely. Millions of visitors walk past those blank spaces every single year. Phones raise snapping photographs of the courtyard's general beauty, and most of them understandably have no idea what they are actually looking at, no idea that some of that stone is scarred on purpose, carrying an old deliberate silence instead of a name. I think about that a lot, honestly. All those tourist cameras out walking past evidence of exactly the kind of quiet, brutal erasure we spent so much of tonight talking about, without ever knowing the story sitting right there under their feet. Which is in its own strange way part of why I wanted to tell you all of this tonight in the first place. Because here is where I want to land before we bring this particular chapter to an end. Historians studying the Vestals today are not nearly as quick to file this story away as simple tragedy or simple triumph, the way older, tidier retelling sometimes did. The honest picture is more complicated than either extreme, and I think that complexity is exactly what makes it worth actually sitting with rather than smoothing over. These were women who held more legal independence than nearly any other women in the ancient world, and who were at the very same time denied the most basic right to choose their own path through it. Women who could pardon a stranger with a single sentence, and who could be sentenced to a horrifying death on evidence that would not have survived contact with an honest courtroom. Women who rode through the streets while senators cleared out of their way, and who could still be publicly humiliated for nothing more than a well-made dress or a quick sense of humour. Power and captivity braided together so tightly across 1100 years that you truly cannot pull one thread free without the other one following right behind it. I do not think that particular contradiction ever fully resolved itself, not once in the entire history of this institution. And maybe that is the most honest thing I can tell you about it at the end of everything we have covered together tonight. Some stories do not owe you a clean resolution. Some stories are worth telling precisely because they refuse to give you one. That is honestly a lot of why I keep telling stories like this one at all night after night instead of sticking to the tidier, simpler version most people already half remember from a textbook somewhere. The tidy version is easier to fall asleep to maybe, but it rarely tells you anything true about what it actually felt like to be the person living inside the history, rather than the person reading about it centuries later, with the ending already known. Amata never got to know how her story ended. Neither did Cornelia walking down those final steps. Neither did Caelia Concordia watching the funding disappear year after year, wondering how much longer any of it would still matter to the people in charge. We get the comfort of hindsight. They only ever got the present moment they were actually standing in, same as the rest of us do every single day of our own lives. That is the story I hope actually stays with you tonight more than any single fact or date. Not a simple story about victims and not a simple story about power, but the far messier, far more honest truth sitting underneath both of those easier versions. Let's go back to Amata one last time, because I think that is really where this whole journey belongs, right back where it started. A 6-year-old girl standing barefoot in a crowded square, watching a stranger's hand wrap around hers, having no possible way of knowing that her story would still be told carefully, deliberately, 2,000 years later to someone falling asleep on the other side of an ocean. She never could have imagined existed in a language that did not exist, yet describing a country that would not exist for well over 1,000 years after her own death. She never got a say in any of it, not at the very beginning. Not the name she was given, not the life she was handed, not the terms of the bargain Rome struck on her behalf, before she was old enough to understand what any of it actually meant. But somehow through all of it, the privilege, the fear, the fire, the silence, the water jars and the miracles and the quiet, terrible field, near the Colin Gate, her story outlasted the empire that created her. It outlasted the emperor who eventually extinguished her flame for good. It outlasted every single person who ever doubted her, accused her, or decided her worth based on nothing sturdier than a rumour about her wardrobe. It is in its own quiet way still burning right now in this exact sentence, in whatever room you're listening from tonight, no matter how many miles or centuries separate you from that 6-year-old girl in the forum. If nothing else survives from everything we have covered together tonight, I hope that particular image does. Not the punishments, not even the privileges. Just a small, ordinary hand reaching out to take hold of another small, ordinary hand. At the very start of a story, neither one of them could have possibly known would still matter to anyone this many centuries later, this far from home. I want to say thank you honestly for spending this much of your evening with me and with her. A story like this one takes hours to actually spend time inside properly, and I know that is a real, meaningful amount of time to give up out of a single night, especially when there are a dozen shorter, easier things you could have chosen to fall asleep to instead. You picked this one. You stayed for all of it. The captio, the fire, the privileges, the accusations, the miracles, the tragedy, and now finally the ending. That matters to me more than you probably realise, and I do not say that as some empty automatic line at the end of a video. Stories like this one take a genuine amount of care to put together, properly digging through what actually survives, sorting fact from legend, trying to hold both the wonder and the horror of it, without flattening either one into something simpler and less true. And it means a great deal that you stayed with me through the whole thing, all the way to this exact sentence this late into your own night. I hope wherever you are right now, whatever time it happens to be on your own clock, that this story did what I always want these stories to do. Not just inform you though, I hope it did that too. I hope it kept you company. I hope it gave your mind somewhere quiet and interesting to sit while the rest of the day finally let go of you. If a martyr's story kept you company tonight, if it made you think a little differently about power or purity, or what we still quietly ask of women even now, I would truly love to hear about it. Tell me which part of her story is still sitting with you as you drift off the captio, the fire watches Cornelia's final walk, or maybe just that small stubborn detail about the statue name scratched off in stone. Let me know where in the world you were tucked in while you listen tonight too. I never get tired of picturing all the different corners of the globe this exact story ends up travelling to. There is another story waiting for you, already taking shape, another corner of history worth stepping into, together another 6-year-old girl or soldier, or forgotten queen or ordinary person, swept up in something far larger than themselves, waiting for their turn to be remembered properly. And I will be right here the next time you are ready to shut your eyes and disappear into it. Until then, sleep well, rest easy, and thank you truly for letting me tell you this one.